In 1993, archaeologists excavating the waterlogged sediment layers of Lake Castoria in northern Greece recovered a small wooden tablet embedded within organic deposits that radiocarbon analysis subsequently dated to approximately 5260 BC. The object, now known as the Dispilio tablet and housed in the Archaeological Museum of Thessaloniki, bears a series of incised symbols arranged in organized rows that display none of the haphazard irregularity one might expect from early experimental notation. The symbol spacing is consistent. The line arrangement is deliberate. Recurring patterns appear with a frequency that linguists associate with grammatical structure rather than decorative repetition. The Dispilio tablet predates the earliest confirmed examples of Sumerian cuneiform by nearly 2,000 years. The conventional scholarly response to this finding has been careful. Mainstream archaeology acknowledges the tablet's anomalous date while generally declining to classify its markings as true writing, categorizing them instead as proto-writing or symbolic notation. But this classification produces an even more troubling paradox. If what the Dispilio tablet displays represents a stage before genuine writing, then the sophistication it demonstrates should have required thousands of years of prior symbolic experimentation to achieve. No earlier examples of that experimentation have been found anywhere in the region. If it represents actual writing, then the received history of human literacy must be revised by nearly 2 millennia. Both possibilities point toward the same disturbing conclusion. Something about the origins of written human language does not conform to the gradual evolutionary model that conventional scholarship has constructed around it. The investigation that follows will draw on cuneiform tablets catalogued in the collections of the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania, undeciphered scripts from the Indus Valley, inscribed wooden boards from the most isolated inhabited island on Earth, encrypted medieval manuscripts that have defeated 400 years of expert analysis, and ancient traditions from cultures as diverse as Mesopotamia, Egypt, pre-Columbian Central America, and Vedic India. All of them preserve remarkably consistent accounts of a single extraordinary event, not the invention of writing, its transmission, from sources that the ancient world did not consider human. The evidence we're about to examine does not merely suggest that ancient literacy is older than our textbooks acknowledge. It suggests that the world's earliest writing systems did not evolve from within human culture. They arrived from outside it. If that possibility reshapes what you understood about human history, consider subscribing to this channel as we continue tracking the evidence that conventional history cannot explain. Every known system of human technology demonstrates traceable developmental progression. Stone tools evolved from crude choppers to precision blades across identifiable archaeological stages spanning tens of thousands of years. Pottery develops from rough hand-formed vessels to wheel-thrown ceramics through documented sequences of improvement recoverable at excavation sites across multiple continents. Agricultural practices advance gradually from broadcast seeding to sophisticated irrigation systems across centuries of accumulated experimentation. Writing should follow the same pattern. Preliminary markings should give way to recognizable pictographs. Pictographs should slowly formalize into syllabic representations. Syllabic systems should gradually acquire grammatical structure capable of expressing abstract concepts. What archaeologists have actually discovered at the world's earliest writing sites contradicts this sequence at every point. At Uruk, the oldest cuneiform tablets dated to approximately 3200 BC already employ over 900 distinct signs organized within a grammatical framework capable of recording abstract administrative, mathematical, and literary information simultaneously. No precursor stages that account for this complexity have been identified at the site or anywhere else in the ancient Near East. The scale of this anomaly becomes clearer when placed against what we know about comparable cognitive and technological achievements. The development of bronze metallurgy can be traced across a span of roughly 2,000 years, from the earliest experimental copper smelting to the mastery of tin-bronze alloy production, with each intermediate stage represented by recoverable artifacts demonstrating incremental advancement. The domestication of wheat from wild einkorn grasses required approximately 5,000 years of selective cultivation before the grain's yield and disease resistance reached levels capable of supporting urban populations. These were not simple achievements. They required sustained intergenerational effort, collective memory, and systematic problem-solving across many lifetimes. Yet both leave behind the archaeological fingerprints of their development in the form of transitional artifacts, failed experiments, and gradual refinements visible in the stratigraphic record. Writing leaves none of these fingerprints at any of the world's primary sites of early script development. The British Museum's collection includes cuneiform tablets from Uruk Level 4, the earliest identified stratum of cuneiform usage, that demonstrate administrative capabilities requiring sophisticated sign conventions, standardized numerical notation, and grammatical markers distinguishing different categories of recorded information. The tablet designated SSEVO 1,2, recovered during systematic excavations of the Iana temple precinct at Uruk, and now housed in the Musée du Louvre in Paris, records a complex transaction involving multiple commodities, numerical quantities expressed in a base 60 notation system, and personnel designations using signs that reappear consistently across dozens of tablets from the same stratum. This is not an early attempt at record keeping. It is a mature bureaucratic tool operating within an already established institutional framework that required written documentation as a matter of routine administrative necessity. The Oxford archaeologist and writing systems scholar Andrew Robinson has documented the pattern that recurs at every primary site of early writing, with a consistency that evolutionary models of script development cannot accommodate. What the archaeological record shows is not the evolution of writing, but the appearance of writing. The distinction is critical. Evolution implies process. Appearance implies event. And the event at each site where it occurs happens within a time frame that the archaeological record cannot subdivide into meaningful developmental stages. The Sumerian case is the most thoroughly documented, but it is not unique. In Egypt, as this investigation will examine in detail, hieroglyphic writing appears in its earliest confirmed examples already structurally complete, employing the full range of functional sign categories and phonetic principles that would characterize the system throughout its 3,000-year subsequent history. In China, the oracle bone inscriptions of the Shang dynasty, discovered during excavations at Anyang in Henan province, beginning in 1899, constitute the earliest confirmed Chinese writing and display a sign inventory of over 2,000 individual characters organized within a sophisticated grammatical system. No Chinese script predating the oracle bones that could represent a developmental precursor has been identified despite intensive archaeological investigation across regions where earlier writing would be expected to appear. The problem deepens when the full technical sophistication of the earliest tablets is considered. The Uruk administrative tablets do not merely record quantities and names. They employ a system of complex sign combinations that allows for the expression of verbal concepts. the modification of sign meanings through contextual placement, and the representation of abstract ideas through combination of otherwise concrete pictographic elements. The linguistic operations required to design such a system from scratch demand an understanding of phonological analysis, grammatical categorization, and symbolic abstraction at a level that researchers in cognitive linguistics associate with highly developed literate traditions rather than nascent experimental notations. To have arrived at this system without prior scribal culture is, by any conventional measure of human cognitive development, effectively impossible. What the evidence demands, and what the segments of this investigation will develop through specific archaeological and textual analysis, is a fundamental reconsideration of the question being asked. Rather than continuing to ask how early humans developed writing within a time frame that the physical record shows was far too short for independent development, we should be asking what the ancient sources themselves consistently tell us, and what they tell us across every culture that produced writing early enough to preserve traditions about its origin is that they did not develop it at all. But before we reach those ancient sources, the physical evidence from a part of the world that conventional history has largely set aside demands our attention. Because in the highlands of southeastern Europe, discoveries have been made that push the anomaly of writing's origins back not by centuries but by millennia, and into cultural contexts where no known mechanism exists to explain their presence. The Dispilio tablet represents only the most dramatic example of a pattern that recurs across southeastern Europe throughout the 6th and 5th millennia BC. The Vinca culture, which flourished along the Danube River in what is now Serbia and Romania between approximately 5,500 and 3,500 BC, produced thousands of artifacts bearing incised symbols that collectively constitute what researchers, including the Romanian archaeologist Nicolae Vlasa, and later the scholars Maria Gimbutas and Harold Herman, have identified as a coherent and systematized symbolic communication system. The Vinca script, as this system has come to be known, encompasses over 250 distinct symbols that appear consistently across sites spanning an area of 300,000 square kilometers. The system demonstrates structural characteristics that linguists associate with true writing, including sequential arrangement, combinatorial rules, and contextual variation suggesting distinct grammatical functions operating beneath an apparently simple surface layer of symbolic notation. The most contentious find within the Vinca cultural sphere emerged in 1961, when Nicolae Vlasa, then an archaeologist with the Cluj-Napoca History Museum, excavated a small pit burial at the Neolithic site of Tartaria in Transylvania. Within the burial, which also contained burned human bones and a collection of ritual objects, Vlasa discovered 3 small clay tablets bearing incised symbols. 2 of the tablets are rectangular in form, and 1 is round with a central perforation. The symbols on the Tartaria tablets bear unmistakable resemblance to early Sumerian pictographic signs, including representations that parallel the Sumerian signs for sheep, cattle, and the enclosed precinct of the temple structure. The tablets were submitted for radiocarbon dating, and the results, which placed the burial context at approximately 5,300 BC, produced an immediate scholarly crisis. If the dating was accurate, the Tartaria tablets predated the earliest Sumerian pictographic tablets by approximately 2,000 years. The scholarly response to this finding divided along lines that have remained largely unchanged in the decades since. Those committed to the conventional model of writing's development in Mesopotamia argue that the Tartaria tablets were either misdated, represented objects of distant origin, or displayed symbol resemblances that were coincidental rather than linguistically meaningful. Those who engaged seriously with the statistical probability of coincidental symbol matching found this explanation increasingly difficult to sustain. Harman, in his analysis of the Vinca symbol system published across multiple studies beginning in the 1990s, applied quantitative methods to assess the likelihood that the parallels between Vinca and early Sumerian signs could be accounted for by chance. His analysis, which identified over 60 specific sign correspondences between the two systems, concluded that the probability of coincidental parallel development was statistically negligible. What the Tartaria tablets demonstrate when their dating is taken seriously is that either symbolic systems of remarkable sophistication developed independently in prehistoric southeastern Europe before any known mechanism existed to produce them, or there existed a common source transmitting the same symbolic conventions to populations separated by both geography and the current boundaries of our knowledge of ancient contact. The Dispilio tablet adds a further and even more troubling dimension to this picture. The wooden tablet was recovered from the site designated Dispilio on the southern shore of Lake Castoria in the Greek region of Western Macedonia by George Ormouziades of the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. The lake environment had preserved the tablet in waterlogged sediment, protecting the organic material from the decomposition that would have destroyed equivalent artifacts at drier sites. Radiocarbon dating of the wood itself, rather than associated organic material that might introduce contamination, returned a date of approximately 5260 BC with a measurement uncertainty of plus or minus 160 years. This places the tablet's manufacture firmly within the Neolithic period, well over a millennium before the earliest acknowledged writing systems appear anywhere in the world. What makes the Dispilio tablet particularly significant is not merely its age, but its settlement context. The tablet was recovered alongside pottery, figurines, and agricultural remains that demonstrate ordinary Neolithic community activity, with no evidence of contact with more complex literate civilizations. The symbols on the tablet cannot therefore be explained as borrowed from more advanced neighbors, because at the time the tablet was made, no confirmed advanced neighbors with writing systems existed anywhere on Earth. The symbols emerge from within a Neolithic European cultural context that conventional archaeology does not credit with the organizational complexity required to produce true writing, and yet they display exactly the structural regularity that such complexity would produce. The pattern that emerges from examining the Vinca, Tartaria, and Dispilio evidence together is one that conventional archaeology has struggled to incorporate into its existing models. These are not isolated anomalies attributable to local variation or measurement error. They represent a coherent body of evidence from multiple sites across a broad geographical region, all pointing to the existence of sophisticated symbolic communication systems in prehistoric Europe, at dates that precede the accepted timeline of writing's origins by margins too large to dismiss through the usual scholarly mechanisms of doubt and deferral. The question that this evidence forces upon any serious investigation is not whether these symbols represent writing. The question is where, in a Neolithic European culture that supposedly lacked the organizational complexity required for written communication, this level of systematic symbolic sophistication came from, and that question, as the examination of the Mesopotamian record in detail reveals, has a precise counterpart that conventional archaeology has never satisfactorily answered at the site that is supposed to be the very birthplace of writing itself. The archaeological sequence at the ancient site of Uruk, excavated systematically by the German Archaeological Institute, across multiple field seasons beginning in 1912 under the direction of Julius Jordan and later Heinrich Lentzen, preserves what should be the most complete record in existence of writing's developmental stages. The site's extraordinary stratigraphic depth encompasses continuous human occupation spanning thousands of years before the appearance of the earliest cuneiform tablets. What the archaeological record at Uruk conspicuously does not contain is any intermediate stage between the simple clay tokens used for accounting that archaeologist Denise Schmant-Besserat documented in the 1970s and the sophisticated multi-sign grammatical system recorded in the earliest cuneiform tablets designated as belonging to Uruk Level 4, dated to approximately 3200 BC. These early tablets, including the specimen designated W20030 in the Vorderasiatisches Museum collection in Berlin, already employ complex sign combinations, grammatical markers, and numerical notation systems that constitute a complete functional writing technology without identifiable antecedent anywhere in the archaeological record. Denise Schmant-Besserat's research, which she developed across a series of publications beginning in 1978 and consolidated in her landmark 2-volume study Before Writing, published in 1992 by the University of Texas Press, proposed an elegant and widely accepted solution to the problem of cuneiform's missing developmental stages. According to her analysis, the 3-dimensional clay tokens found in small sealed envelopes of clay at sites across the ancient Near East represented a proto-writing stage in which individual tokens stood for specific commodities. When administrators began pressing the tokens against the wet clay surface of the envelopes before enclosing them, the resulting impressions preserved a 2-dimensional record of the transaction's contents. From this practice of impressing token shapes into clay tablets, the earliest cuneiform pictographs evolved as simplified representations of the 3-dimensional tokens. The theory is internally coherent and has been broadly influential in the academic study of writing's origins. Its central problem is chronological. The transition from the 3-dimensional token system to the earliest full cuneiform script, as the archaeological record at Uruk and other sites documents it, occurs within what stratigraphic analysis indicates is a span of approximately 100 to 150 years. This is the time frame within which a system capable of representing only discrete commodity quantities using simple impressed shapes apparently transformed into a system of over 900 distinct signs capable of recording verbal statements, personal names, professional titles, and abstract administrative categories requiring grammatical specification. No intermediate tablets showing a gradual sign elaboration process has been recovered from Uruk or any other site. Despite the extraordinary completeness of the Uruk excavation record, despite a century of sustained and methodologically sophisticated archaeological investigation, and despite the fact that the dry Mesopotamian environment preserves clay tablets across millennia with a fidelity that has given scholars access to hundreds of thousands of individual documents from the region's ancient past. The German Oriental Society's systematic excavations of the Iana precinct at Uruk produced thousands of administrative tablets from Level 4 and the immediately following Level 3 contexts. Hans Nissen of the Free University of Berlin, who led a major reanalysis of the Uruk tablet corpus in the 1980s using computational tools then becoming available to archaeological research, has documented that the Level 4 tablets already display full administrative complexity. The tablets record not only commodity quantities, but also distributions to named individuals designated by professional titles, transfers between institutional departments designated by specific sign combinations, and calculations involving multiple quantity categories within single transactions. The system presupposes not only the existence of the signs themselves, but the existence of an institutional structure complex enough to require such detailed documentation and a professional class of trained scribes capable of producing it consistently across thousands of individual records. Consider what this means in practical terms. Someone, at some identifiable but archaeologically invisible point in the stratigraphic sequence between level 5 and level 4 at Uruk, designed a system of over 900 signs, established their combinatorial grammar, trained a professional class of scribes in their use, and created the institutional demand for written records sophisticated enough to justify the entire system's existence and maintenance. This is not an incremental process. It is a complete cognitive and institutional transformation, accomplished within a time frame that the physical evidence cannot subdivide. The clay record at Uruk shows the system in fully functional form at its first appearance, and shows nothing resembling its creation before that moment. The question that this imposes upon honest investigation is not how the Sumerians invented writing. The question is how a complete writing system, with professional scribes already trained in its use, appeared at a specific point in the archaeological sequence without the physical traces of its own creation. Those are two fundamentally different questions, and only one of them is what the evidence actually supports. That same question acquires its full weight when placed alongside the evidence from a civilization that appeared at approximately the same historical moment, achieved sophistication that rivaled Mesopotamia in every measurable dimension, used a script of comparable structural complexity, and then maintained a silence across 4,000 years of human inquiry that no amount of scholarly effort has yet been able to penetrate. The Indus Valley civilization flourished across an area of approximately 1,250,000 square kilometers in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, between approximately 3,000 and 1,500 BC, making it the largest of the ancient world's three great early civilizations by territorial extent. Its two primary urban centers, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, housed populations estimated at between 40,000 and 100,000 individuals within city plans of sophisticated regularity, featuring standardized brick dimensions, straight street grids, advanced drainage infrastructure, and complex building layouts that demonstrate centralized planning authority of an order that rivals anything documented in contemporary Mesopotamia or Egypt. The civilization left behind over 4,000 inscribed objects bearing a script that, despite more than 150 years of sustained scholarly analysis and the application of modern computational decipherment methods by teams including researchers at the University of Washington and the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, has never been successfully translated. The Indus script remains the longest-standing undeciphered writing system in the world. The physical evidence of Indus Valley urban sophistication has been documented across excavations conducted at over 1,000 sites since the British archaeologist John Marshall supervised the first systematic investigations at Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa during the 1920s. The baked bricks used in construction across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers maintain an identical ratio of length to width to height of 4 to 2 to 1, a standardization that requires coordinated manufacturing protocols across an enormous geographical area, maintained with a precision that has no parallel in the contemporary ancient world. The drainage systems at Mohenjo-Daro which include covered brick channels running beneath the streets to collect wastewater from individual houses and direct it to larger collection points outside the city perimeter, represent hydraulic engineering that would not be surpassed anywhere in the ancient world until Roman infrastructure was developed nearly 2,000 years later. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro, a structure measuring approximately 12 meters in length by 7 meters in width and nearly 2.5 meters in depth, is sealed with a layer of natural tar and surrounded by colonnaded galleries, indicating a function both ritualistic and administratively governed that is entirely consistent with the kind of institutional complexity that generates systematic demand for written records. The script that this civilization used appears on stamp seals, clay and copper tablets, and pottery recovered from sites distributed across the entire Indus cultural zone. Approximately 400 to 450 individual signs have been identified in the corpus, a number consistent with a mixed logosyllabic writing system of the type used in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and the signs appear in sequences of average length between 4 and 5 signs, with a maximum documented sequence of 17 signs. The stamp seals carved from steatite and fired to a white finish display characteristic combinations of Indus script signs above depictions of animals, including the distinctive unicorn figure that appears as the most common motif in the corpus. These seals were apparently used for administrative identification in commercial transactions, implying a developed mercantile and institutional economy sophisticated enough to require individual authenticated documentation for the purposes of trade and governance. The decipherment efforts directed at the Indus script represent one of the most sustained and ultimately unresolved scholarly endeavours in the history of linguistics. The Finnish scholar Asko Parpola of the University of Helsinki has dedicated more than 5 decades to the problem, proposing that the underlying language belongs to the Dravidian family and advancing specific sign readings based on the rebus principle of phonetic substitution across a series of publications that constitute the most comprehensive single body of work on the subject in existence. The American scholars Steve Farmer and Michael Witzel of Harvard University have argued in the opposite direction, proposing in a paper published in 2004 that the Indus script is not a writing system at all, but a collection of non-linguistic religious and political symbols whose short average inscription length is inconsistent with recording sustained verbal content. Both positions remain actively contested, and neither has achieved the threshold of scholarly consensus that would constitute a genuine advance in understanding what the Indus inscriptions actually contain. It was into this impasse that the computational analysis conducted by Rajesh Rao of the University of Washington and colleagues introduced a finding of considerable significance. Rao's team, in research published in the journal Science in 2009, applied conditional entropy analysis to the Indus script corpus and compared the resulting statistical profile with those of known writing systems and known non-linguistic symbol sequences, including DNA-based sequences, protein sequences, and the ordering of musical notes in compositions. The conditional entropy of the Indus script fell within the mathematical range consistently produced by natural human languages and specifically resembled the statistical profile of ancient Sumerian and of Sanskrit. It fell clearly outside the range produced by non-linguistic symbol sequences of every category tested. This finding has a direct and underappreciated implication. If the Indus script's statistical structure matches that of language, then the century-and-a-half-old failure to translate it is not evidence that it contains nothing meaningful. It is evidence that it contains something whose decipherment key has not yet been recovered, or perhaps was deliberately removed from the traditions that followed the civilization's disappearance. The Indus Valley civilization ceased around 1900 BC with extraordinary completeness, leaving its largest cities abandoned and its script unused in any successor culture. What it recorded, in a system whose statistical properties confirm it was recording something organized according to the structural principles of natural language, remains entirely unknown after 4,000 years of human inquiry. That silence stands in precise and instructive contrast to the situation in Mesopotamia, where the ancient sources preserved not only the script itself, but explicit and institutionally maintained accounts of where that script came from and by whose authority it was given. And it is in those accounts that the investigation arrives at what may be the most significant and least examined evidence of all, because what the oldest literate civilization on Earth preserved was not a tradition of having invented writing, it was a tradition of having received it. Among the most extraordinary texts preserved in the cuneiform literature of ancient Mesopotamia is a composition known to scholars as Enki and the World Order, preserved across multiple tablet fragments from the Nippur collection, held jointly by the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology and the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. The text describes in systematic detail how Enki, the Sumerian deity of wisdom, water, and craft knowledge, establishes the fundamental principles governing all domains of civilization, including agriculture, animal husbandry, metalworking, and the crafts of the scribe. What makes this composition particularly significant for understanding ancient conceptions of language is a specific passage in which Enki claims explicit authority over human speech itself. The tablet describes Enki as the one who opens the mouth of the people, the Lord who determines the names of all things, the one whose utterance establishes meaning for all that exists between heaven and earth. This assertion of linguistic sovereignty is not presented as metaphorical in the surrounding passages. It is described as a practical administrative function with identifiable mechanisms of operation. The composition has been reconstructed by the Assyriologist Samuel Noah Kramer, whose pioneering translation work in the mid-20th century first brought this text to sustained scholarly attention from approximately 470 lines of cuneiform text spread across multiple overlapping tablet fragments from the Nippur collection. The reconstruction has been subsequently refined by Bent Ulster, Jeremy Black of the Oxford Oriental Institute, and other scholars working with the Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature project, which has produced the most comprehensive digital edition of the Sumerian literary corpus currently available. The text dates in its written form to approximately 2000 BC during the Third Dynasty of Ur, but internal evidence, including archaic grammatical forms and compositional characteristics, strongly suggests it preserves traditions considerably older, possibly extending to the earliest stratum of Sumerian literary production, at a period close to the script's own appearance in the archaeological record. The passage concerning Enki's authority over language must be understood within the broader Sumerian conceptual framework of the ME, a term that Assyriologists have rendered variously as divine decrees, divine powers, or fundamental principles of civilization. The ME in Sumerian theological and administrative literature represents something more specific and more operational than the English translations convey. They are not simply abstract principles or moral guidelines. They are functional protocols, the specific operational rules that govern each domain of civilizational activity. The Sumerian text known as Inanna and the ME, another composition preserved in the Nippur corpus, provides a catalogue of over 100 specific ME that includes the high priesthood, the scribal arts, the descent to the underworld, the ascent from the underworld, the art of the smith, the art of the leather worker, the instruments of music, and crucially what the text designates as the art of the tongue, identified separately from the scribal arts as a distinct and specifically governed domain of knowledge, with its own administrative authority and its own protocols of transmission. The identification of language as a ME, as a fundamental decree requiring specific governance and having an identifiable divine administrator, has implications that Sumerological scholarship has not adequately pursued. Within the Sumerian conceptual framework, a Singi is not invented, it is received. The high priesthood was not created by human religious organization. It was given as a ME by divine authority and must be properly administered according to its governing protocol. If language itself is a ME, then the Sumerian tradition is stating directly, without metaphor or mythological elaboration, that language was not developed by human cognitive evolution. It was given, administered, and governed according to protocols established by an authority that the texts identify as Enki, an authority whose nature and origin the texts describe in terms that conventional scholarship has declined to take at face value. The Aduba texts, a group of compositions preserved in the Nippur corpus that describe the curriculum and daily life of the Sumerian Scribal Academy, provide specific institutional details about how this understanding of linguistic authority was transmitted in practice across generations of human scholarship. These texts, translated and analyzed in detail by the Sumerologist Niek Veldhuis of the University of California, Berkeley, describe a hierarchical system of scribal education in which students were admitted to progressively more advanced levels of instruction based on demonstrated mastery of sign forms, lexical lists, and ultimately what the texts designate as the secrets of the tablet house. This category of knowledge is treated in the compositions as qualitatively different from ordinary administrative literacy, not simply more advanced in degree but different in kind. Students who reach this level are described in the Aduba texts as those who know the tongue of the gods, a designation that the surrounding administrative contexts treat not as metaphor but as a technical classification indicating mastery of a specific and restricted body of knowledge with specific requirements for access and specific institutional consequences for unauthorized transmission to unprepared recipients. The consistency between what Enki and the world order asserts at the theological level and what the Aduba texts document at the institutional level across more than 1,000 years of continuous scribal tradition is not coincidental. Both categories of text point toward a conclusion that the Sumerian tradition states directly and without apparent awareness that it requires defense against modern skepticism. Language is not a human invention. It is a received technology, administered by divine authority and transmitted through specific institutional channels to human recipients who meet specific preparation requirements established at the beginning of the scribal tradition itself. What that source actually was, and what the restricted knowledge it transmitted actually contained in its most advanced registers, is a question that the evidence examined in the segments that follow will approach from multiple directions. For now, what matters is recognizing that the oldest literate civilization in the world, the civilization that supposedly gave writing to humanity through its own developmental ingenuity within a time frame, the archaeological record cannot explain, preserved no tradition of having invented writing at all. It preserved instead a detailed, institutionally maintained, and rigorously protected account of having received it from a source it named, whose authority over human language it treated not as mythology, but as administrative fact. The evidence for this reception rather than invention of writing becomes even more compelling when the mathematical content preserved within the Nipper scribal corpus is examined in the full technical detail that its significance demands. The cuneiform tablets recovered from the ancient scribal centre of Nipper, excavated across multiple campaigns beginning in 1888 by the University of Pennsylvania expedition, led by John Punnett Peters and Hermann Hilprecht, include a subset of mathematical texts that have consistently unsettled conventional historians of science. The Nipper mathematical corpus, spanning thousands of tablets now distributed between the University Museum in Philadelphia and the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, demonstrates computational techniques including quadratic equations, square root extraction, and iterative approximation methods that would not be formally rediscovered in Western mathematical tradition until the Renaissance. What makes this corpus particularly relevant to understanding the origins of ancient script systems is a specific category of tablet that encodes mathematical relationships within the structural conventions of the writing system itself, as if the script was designed from its inception to carry numerical and astronomical information at multiple simultaneous levels of meaning, invisible to readers who lack the specific decipherment keys necessary to perceive them. The implications of this mathematical sophistication become fully apparent when the Nipper corpus is examined by scholars equipped to recognize what they are looking at. Otto Neugebauer of Brown University, whose foundational analysis of Babylonian mathematical texts published across the 1930s and 1940s established the modern study of ancient mathematics, documented that Babylonian mathematical procedures routinely employed techniques that European mathematics did not develop until the work of algebraists in the 16th century of the Common Era. The operational gap between what Babylonian scribes routinely performed and what the conventional timeline of mathematical development would predict they should have been capable of amounts to roughly 2,000 years of advancement appearing in the wrong historical period. The specific tablet that has attracted the most sustained analytical attention in this context is the Plimpton 322 tablet, now held in the Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Columbia University in New York. The tablet, dating to the Old Babylonian period at approximately 1800 BC and first published by Neugebauer and Abraham Sachs in 1945, displays a table of numbers that, when analyzed using modern number theory, reveals a systematic generation of Pythagorean triples, whole number solutions to the fundamental geometric relationship most familiar in modern mathematics as the theorem attributed to the Greek mathematician Pythagoras. The tablet generates these triples using a method that demonstrates not merely familiarity with the geometric relationship, but theoretical understanding of its general algebraic structure. The theorem would not receive its formal proof in Western mathematical tradition until the 6th century BC, 1,200 years after the Plimpton tablet was produced. The Yale Babylonian collection holds another specimen of equal significance, the tablet designated YBC 7289, a small clay disc bearing a drawn square with its diagonals, carries a numerical annotation in the old Babylonian sexagesimal notation that modern mathematicians recognize as an approximation of the square root of 2 accurate to 6 decimal places. The square root of 2 is an irrational number whose decimal expansion continues without repeating. The Babylonian approximation reaches its accuracy using a computational method whose algorithm, when reconstructed from the tablet's notation, reveals a technique equivalent to what mathematicians would later identify as iterative numerical refinement. The scribe who produced this tablet was not working intuitively. The procedure documented on its surface required theoretical understanding of numerical approximation, that precedes its official discovery in mathematical history by over 2,000 years. What makes this mathematical sophistication directly relevant to the question of writing's origins is the relationship between the base 60 number system used throughout Babylonian mathematics and the astronomical cycles that the Mesopotamian scribal tradition preserved with such consistent precision. 60 serves as the foundational unit of the Babylonian numerical system, not because it is a conveniently round number in any intuitive human sense, but because it is the smallest integer divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30 simultaneously, making it optimal for expressing the fractional relationships that appear in astronomical calculations involving ratios between different celestial cycles. The fact that the same base governs both everyday administrative calculation and astronomical precision measurement within the same script system indicates that the two domains were never treated as separate categories of knowledge in the Mesopotamian tradition. They were aspects of a unified system whose outer layer was administrative literacy, and whose inner layer was something the scribal texts themselves describe as fundamentally different in kind. The specific numerical values that recur throughout the Nippur mathematical corpus carry astronomical significance that extends beyond calendar calculation. The number 432,000, which appears as a fundamental chronological unit in the Sumerian king list's antediluvian chronology, represents exactly 100 repetitions of 4,320, which is itself twice 2,160. 2,160 represents the duration in years of one precessional age, the period during which the spring equinox point moves through a single zodiacal constellation during the 25,920-year complete precessional cycle. The mathematical relationships embedded in the Sumerian king list chronological framework are not the random products of mythological numerology. They are the encoded signatures of an astronomical knowledge system sophisticated enough to calculate the precessional cycle with precision that mainstream scholarship does not credit to any culture before the Greek astronomer Hipparchus in the 2nd century BC, a full 2,000 years after these numbers were being inscribed into Sumerian clay. The script system that carried this mathematical encoding appears, when this interpretation is followed to its logical conclusion, to have been designed not merely as an administrative tool for recording grain distributions and labor obligations, but as a multi-level information storage system capable of preserving astronomical and mathematical knowledge within the structural conventions of everyday bureaucratic writing, invisible to unequipped readers and accessible in its deeper registers only to those trained in the specific decipherment keys that the scribal tradition's most restricted category of instruction preserved. This possibility, which the mathematical evidence supports with a consistency that coincidence cannot explain, becomes even more evident when the Nippur corpus is examined not only for its explicit mathematical content, but for what specific literary compositions reveal about the nature of the knowledge the script system was designed to protect. The Kesh temple hymn, preserved on tablets discovered at the ancient site of Nippur and dated by scholars to approximately 2300 BC in its written form, though internal evidence suggests it derives from oral traditions considerably older, is widely recognized as one of the most linguistically complex compositions in the ancient Sumerian literary corpus. The text complexity has been a persistent challenge for translators, combining grammatical forms that do not appear in any other known Sumerian document, phonological patterns that suggest systematic poetic engineering beyond the capacity of improvisational oral composition, and numerical relationships embedded within the text's structural organization that the sumerologist Thorkild Jacobsen identified across his career of translation work as exhibiting a degree of deliberate mathematical calculation that exceeds what oral literary tradition can plausibly generate. The hymn's description of the Kesh temple as a location where the divine emes, the fundamental decrees of civilization, are stored and transmitted in specific encrypted form, raises questions that extend far beyond conventional literary analysis into territory that mainstream scholarship has declined to pursue. The hymn structure has been analyzed in detail by the Assyriologist Ulke Sjöberg of the University of Pennsylvania, whose work on the composition identified 8 distinct sections that ancient Sumerian scribes themselves designated, using a term translatable as chambers or houses, a structural designation that mirrors the physical organization of the Kesh temple as a repository of distinct knowledge domains. Each section is dedicated to a specific divine function associated with the temple, and the cumulative description of these functions reveals an institution operating not merely as a religious center, but as a protected repository for the most sensitive categories of knowledge in the Sumerian administrative system. The grammatical anomalies within the composition are not the product of scribal error or regional dialect variation. They constitute a systematic pattern that appears with deliberate regularity at specific points in the text's organizational structure. The sumerologist Daniel Foxvogg of the University of California, Berkeley, whose grammatical analysis of the hymn contributed to the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature edition, produced by the Oriental Institute of the University of Oxford, identified verbal forms in the text that employ archaic prefix patterns, no longer in active use during the period of the text's inscription, suggesting either deliberate archaism serving a preservational function or the actual preservation of compositional forms from an earlier stage of the Sumerian language than any other surviving text represents. Either possibility implies that the hymn was treated as a text requiring verbatim transmission rather than updated retelling, a characteristic associated in the Mesopotamian scribal tradition, specifically with texts considered to contain fixed technical information that could be corrupted by paraphrase. The numerical structure of the Kesh temple hymn provides the most direct evidence of its encoded mathematical content. The composition's 8 sections contain line counts of 41, 32, 29, 36, 28, 33, 27, and 38 lines, respectively. When these numbers are analyzed using the base 60 mathematical framework that governs the Nippur mathematical corpus, they reveal relationships to the astronomical constants already identified in the scribal tradition's chronological and astronomical texts. The total line count of 264 shares mathematical relationships to the precessional cycle that appear in the kingless chronology and in the organizational structure of the Malapin astronomical compendium, suggesting that the architectural encoding of astronomical constants within literary structure was a systematic rather than an occasional feature of the Sumerian scribal tradition's most carefully maintained compositions. The emes described in the Kesh temple hymn, as stored within the temple's sealed chambers, are enumerated with a specificity that goes beyond the general catalogue found in other eme texts. The hymn identifies specific categories of technical knowledge, including what the text designates in the most archaic passage of its final section as the words that no mouth has spoken, a category of knowledge so restricted that its content is not described even within the hymn's elaborately organized 8-chamber structure, but is only acknowledged as existing and as being held in the most protected interior of the repository. The existence of a designated category of specifically unspeakable knowledge within a composition that is itself structurally encoded with astronomical mathematics suggests that the Kesh temple functioned as the outermost visible layer of a knowledge preservation system, whose most interior content was never committed to any form that could be recovered from without the specific preparation the tradition required. This understanding of the Sumerian scribal tradition as the visible expression of a much deeper and more restricted knowledge system receives its most striking external confirmation not from another Mesopotamian tablet, but from a document that claims to preserve knowledge older than the civilization that produced the cuneiform script itself. The emerald tablet, known in Arabic as Kitab Sir al-Khalika, which translates roughly as the Book of the Secret of Creation, presents textual scholars with one of history's most persistent and under-examined puzzles. The earliest Arabic manuscript containing the text dates to approximately the 8th century of the Common Era, but the document itself claims provenance from sources of incomparably greater antiquity. The Arabic version attributes the text to Apollonius of Tyana, a first-century philosopher who is said to have discovered it within a hidden vault beneath a statue in the Anatolian city of Tyana, inscribed on a tablet of green stone held in the hands of a preserved corpse. What has received insufficient scholarly attention is the degree to which the Emerald Tablet's cosmological framework, including its foundational principle of correspondence between macrocosmic and microcosmic order, and its descriptions of matter manipulation through vibrational principles of universal application, parallels in precise technical detail the contents of specific cuneiform tablets from the late Sumerian period that describe Enki's methods of working with primordial substances to alter the properties of physical matter. The Latin translation of the Emerald Tablet, first appearing in European scholarship through the commentary tradition associated with Albertus Magnus and subsequently referenced by Roger Bacon, presents a cosmological framework of 12 principal assertions that Western alchemical tradition treated as foundational principles of natural philosophy for more than a millennium. The assertion that what is above is like what is below, and what is below is like what is above, presented not as metaphysical poetry, but as a technical description of operational principles governing matter and energy, encapsulates a framework of systematic correspondence between macrocosmic and microcosmic order that appears in identical functional form in the organizational logic of the Malapian astronomical compendium, where stellar movements are explicitly correlated with terrestrial events through a correspondence system treating both domains as expressions of the same underlying organizational principles. The Emerald Tablet presents this principle not as an observation but as a mechanism, one that can be applied through specific procedures to produce specific material transformations. The parallel with specific Sumerian tablets becomes most precise when the Emerald Tablet's description of working through the father principle of the sun and the mother principle of the moon to produce the one thing is compared with the Sumerian composition known as Enki's Journey to Nippur, preserved in fragments from the Nippur corpus. This text describes procedures by which Enki manipulates the fundamental properties of matter, using principles that surrounding compositions identify as belonging to the most restricted category of the ME system, accessible only to those who have mastered every outer level of scribal knowledge. The specific procedures described involve the combination of solar and lunar energetic principles in ratios that produce transformative effects on physical substances, a technical framework whose content corresponds with remarkable precision to the 12 assertions of the Emerald Tablet, despite the separation of these two documents by geography, language, and the entire span of Mesopotamian civilization between them, The Hermetic tradition's explicit claim that the knowledge preserved in the Emerald Tablet predates. The flood receives important contextual support from what Manetho, the Egyptian priest and historian of the 3rd century BC, preserved of the temple traditions of Heliopolis. Manetho's account, preserved in fragments by Josephus and Eusebius, describes a tradition maintained in the Heliopolitan temple libraries, according to which the god Thoth, identified in Greek sources as Hermes Trismegistus, concealed the books of divine wisdom within underground repositories before the great flood that destroyed the previous age of the world, specifically so that they would survive the catastrophe and be available to guide the reconstruction of civilization by survivors. The Emerald Tablet in the Arabic tradition that preserves its oldest available form was discovered within precisely such an underground repository, its content preserved across whatever period separated its creation from its discovery in a form whose parallels with the most restricted categories of Sumerian scribal knowledge represent either the most extraordinary coincidence in the history of intellectual tradition or the most direct evidence available for the existence of a common pre-flood source, transmitting the same foundational knowledge to multiple subsequent civilizations through deliberately constructed vehicles of preservation. The documents examined so far have at least the advantage of yielding to analysis, however restricted that analysis may be to their outer layers. The investigation now turns to a category of evidence that removes even this minimal point of entry, because the scripts that form the next layer of this pattern have not merely proven difficult to translate, they have proven, across the full application of every analytical resource that modern scholarship can bring to bear upon them, to be completely and systematically impenetrable. 3 of the world's most important undeciphered ancient writing systems present a collective pattern so consistent that it demands explanation beyond the conventional scholarly response of insufficient sample size or inadequate research effort. Linear A, the script of the Minoan civilization of Bronze Age Crete, is attested on approximately 1,500 inscriptions recovered from sites including the palace complex at Hagia Triada, Akrotiri, and Knossos, and has resisted decipherment despite the fact that its successor script, Linear B, was successfully decoded by Michael Ventris in 1952. Rongorongo, the hieroglyphic script of Easter Island, survives on 26 wooden tablets preserved in institutions including the Smithsonian Institution, the Bishop Museum in Honolulu, and the Vatican Library. The Indus script appears on over 4,000 inscribed objects from a civilization that endured for more than a millennium. All 3 writing systems appear in their earliest archaeological contexts already fully systematized, and all 3 have resisted comprehensive decipherment despite sustained application of modern computational and linguistic analysis by some of the most sophisticated research teams in contemporary scholarship. The Minoan civilization that produced Linear A represents one of the most architecturally and artistically sophisticated Bronze Age cultures in the Mediterranean world. The palace complexes at Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros display multi-story construction, sophisticated plumbing systems, elaborate fresco programs, and administrative organization of a complexity that rivals contemporary Mesopotamia. The palace at Knossos, excavated by Arthur Evans beginning in 1900, covers an area of approximately 22,000 square meters across 5 stories and contains hundreds of rooms organized around a central court, with light wells, drainage channels, and storage magazines equipped with ceramic storage vessels of standardized capacity that imply centralized administrative control over the distribution of agricultural surplus. This level of institutional complexity generated substantial demand for written records, and Linear A served that demand across roughly 500 years of Minoan palatial civilization from approximately 1800 to 1450 BC. The decipherment of Linear B by Michael Ventris in 1952 demonstrated that the later script, which derived visually from Linear A and shared a substantial proportion of its sign inventory, recorded an early form of Greek. This success made the persistent failure to decipher Linear A all the more analytically revealing. Approximately 80 of the roughly 90 Linear A signs have direct visual equivalents in Linear B, and the phonetic values established for the later script can be applied to those shared signs in Linear A texts. The result is a series of syllabic readings that produce consistent phonological sequences but no recognizable language. The underlying language of Linear A produces phonological structures that are unlike any identified member of any known ancient language family, and this persistent incomprehensibility has led some researchers to propose that Minoan was not merely an extinct unrelated language, but a deliberately constructed linguistic system designed to be inaccessible to those without specific initiatory preparation, a possibility that the evidence cannot currently eliminate. The case of Rongorongo confronts the problem of writing's origins from a completely different geographical and cultural direction. Easter Island, known to its Polynesian inhabitants as Rapa Nui, is the most isolated inhabited land in the world. Lying approximately 3,700 kilometers west of the Chilean coast and approximately 2,500 kilometers from the nearest inhabited island. The script was first brought to the attention of Western scholarship in 1864, when the Catholic Bishop Tepano Jausen received a gift whose wrapping material included a wooden tablet covered in incised signs. Subsequent investigation found that the indigenous population possessed additional tablets of the same type, though the number had been drastically reduced by the catastrophic population collapse that followed slave raids and epidemic disease in the 1860s. The 26 surviving tablets display a script of approximately 120 individual signs, used in a reading direction that alternates between left to right and right to left on successive lines, a convention known as boustrophedon that appears in other ancient writing systems including early Greek inscriptions, without any plausible mechanism of cultural transmission connecting Easter Island to those traditions. What makes Rongorongo particularly significant for understanding the global pattern of writing's anomalous origins is precisely the extreme isolation of the island where it was found. The conventional explanation for similarities between geographically separated writing systems invokes cultural contact, trade networks, or migration as transmission mechanisms. For Easter Island, separated from every other inhabited land by thousands of kilometers of open ocean, no such mechanisms can be proposed within any plausible time frame, and yet Rongorongo displays a structural organization including sign inventory size, sign frequency distribution, and directional reading convention that shares more structural characteristics with other ancient scripts than random independent development would predict. The researcher Stephen Roger Fisher, who proposed a partial decipherment of Rongorongo, based on reading the tablets as cosmogonic chants describing creation cycles, identified specific sign combinations that parallel compositional structures found in other Pacific Island oral traditions. But the decipherment has not achieved scholarly consensus, and Rongorongo remains as resistant to analysis as Linear A and the Indus script despite sustained attention from specialists across multiple disciplines. The pattern that unites these three writing systems is not merely their resistance to decipherment, it is the specific character of that resistance. Each displays statistical properties consistent with natural human language, while systematically refusing to yield to the analytical methods that have successfully decoded every other ancient script subjected to comparable sustained expert analysis. This selective impermeability suggests not a failure of analytical method, but a fundamental difference in what these scripts encode. If what they contain is a language designed to be inaccessible to those without specific prior knowledge, rather than a language that developed organically within an accessible cultural tradition, then the failure to decipher them from the outside is not an embarrassing scholarly limitation. It is confirmation that the scripts are functioning exactly as intended, and it is in this context that the most intensively analyzed undeciphered document in modern cryptographic history becomes most significant, because whatever the Voynich manuscript contains, it has proven equally resistant to analysis while leaving behind more detailed evidence of what it might be than any of the ancient undeciphered scripts, and that evidence points in a direction that the investigation cannot ignore. In 1912, the Polish book dealer Wilfrid Voynich purchased from the Jesuit college at Villa Mondragone in Frascati, Italy, an illustrated manuscript that would become the most intensively analyzed and consistently undeciphered document in modern cryptographic history. The manuscript, now designated as MS 408 in the Beinecker Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University, comprises 240 pages of vellum covered in an unknown script, accompanied by detailed illustrations depicting botanical specimens, astronomical diagrams, biological figures, and what appear to be pharmaceutical preparations of considerable complexity. Carbon dating of the vellum, conducted in 2009 by the University of Arizona Accelerator Mass Spectrometry Laboratory, placed its manufacture between 1404 and 1438 of the Common Era. Yet computational analysis conducted across multiple subsequent decades by research teams, including professional cryptographers formerly employed by the National Security Agency and linguists from Johns Hopkins University, has produced no consensus interpretation of the script, no identified language family to which it belongs, and no confirmed decipherment of even a single word within its 240 pages. The manuscript's content is organized into thematic sections whose subjects are immediately recognizable, despite the complete impenetrability of the script itself. The herbal section, comprising the majority of the document's pages, depicts plants drawn in a distinctive style that combines accurately observed botanical structure with systematic inclusion of features that do not correspond to any identified plant species in the known world. Botanists, including the researcher Arthur Tucker, proposed in 2013 that some plant illustrations could be identified as New World species, an identification that would carry significant implications for the manuscript's provenance and for the nature of the knowledge it records. The astronomical section depicts circular diagrams containing stars, suns, and moons, arranged in concentric configurations whose relationships to actual celestial mechanics have been analyzed without yielding consistent interpretations. The biological section depicts human figures immersed in connected pools and channels whose architectural arrangement bears structural resemblance to bath complexes found at Indus Valley sites, a resemblance noted by multiple researchers without finding explanation within any current interpretive framework. The cryptographic analysis of the Voynich manuscript has produced a finding of fundamental importance that popular accounts of the document's mystery consistently underemphasize. William Friedman, the greatest American cryptanalyst of the 20th century and the principal figure responsible for breaking the Japanese purple cipher during the Second World War, spent years analyzing the manuscript and concluded that it represents a genuinely constructed language rather than a cipher applied to any known natural language. The distinction matters enormously. A cipher substitutes alternative symbols for the characters of an existing language, while preserving that language's underlying grammatical and statistical frequency structure. A constructed language creates its own grammatical and frequency structures from the ground up, and can therefore be made systematically impenetrable to outside analysis if its structural principles are unknown to the analyst, because the analyst cannot use the statistical properties of any natural language as a decipherment lever. The research published by Marcello Montemurro of the University of Manchester and Damian Zanet of the Centro Atomico Bariloche in 2013 analyzed the Voynich manuscript's semantic structure using methods derived from information theory, and found that the text displays long-range correlations between words that are characteristic of natural human languages and are absent from random text, from simple ciphers, and from modern constructed languages including Esperanto. The specific type of long-range correlation identified is associated in natural languages with the semantic clustering of related content into topically organized sections, suggesting that the Voynich text conveys genuine structured information organized according to subject matter in a way that mirrors the thematic organization of its clearly recognizable illustrated sections. What the manuscript contains, the evidence confirms, is real information. What it is not yet is legible to anyone in the world who has attempted to read it across 4 centuries of sustained analytical effort, and the collective weight of that sustained failure, placed alongside the equally sustained failures of Linear A, Rongorongo, and the Indus script, establishes a pattern whose implications cannot be contained within any conventional explanation of ancient literacy. The ancient scribal tradition was not merely recording what it knew. In its most restricted registers, it was preserving something that it specifically intended only certain prepared minds to ever be able to reach. The recognition that ancient scribal traditions were operating at multiple simultaneous levels of meaning is not confined to the undeciphered scripts whose resistance to analysis has been the subject of the preceding examination. Even among the writing systems that scholars have successfully translated, detailed structural analysis has revealed layers of encoded information that standard literary and administrative readings completely miss, and nowhere is this layered encoding more precisely documented than in the astronomical content embedded within the structural architecture of the cuneiform script tradition itself. The relationship between ancient writing systems and astronomical knowledge runs far deeper than the conventional observation that early scribes used writing to record celestial observations and calendar data. At multiple ancient sites, detailed structural analysis of script systems has revealed that the organizational principles governing how signs are arranged, combined, and sequenced encode specific astronomical data as a foundational layer of the writing system itself, invisible to readers who approach the texts as simple administrative or literary records. The Babylonian astronomical compendium known as Mul-Apin, preserved across numerous cuneiform tablets, including the British Museum specimen designated BM 86378, provides one of the most striking examples of this integration. The compendium organizes its star catalogue into 3 parallel celestial pathways, and when the angular relationships between stars within each pathway are calculated using the positional data preserved in the text, they produce mathematical constants that correspond precisely to the mechanics of the precessional cycle, a 25,920-year astronomical phenomenon that requires centuries of systematic observation merely to detect. The standard scholarly edition of Mullapin, prepared by Hermann Hunger of the University of Vienna and David Pingree of Brown University, and published in 1989 by the Austrian Academy of Sciences, established the canonical text from manuscripts spanning the first millennium BC, while demonstrating that the original composition draws on observational data considerably older. The compendium's 3 parallel pathways, designated the Way of Enlil for the northern celestial hemisphere, the Way of Anu for the equatorial region, and the Way of Enki for the southern hemisphere, organize 66 named stars and star groups with precise notations of their heliacal rising dates, the calendar dates on which each star first becomes visible just before sunrise after a period of invisibility. The precision of these rising date notations has allowed modern astronomers to identify the actual stars described with confidence, and that identification reveals something the conventional interpretation as a calendar aid does not account for. The heliacal rising dates preserved in Mullapin do not match the actual rising dates of the identified stars during the period of the text's composition in the first millennium BC. They match the rising dates of those same stars during a period approximately 1700 years earlier, placing the original observational data at approximately 3400 BC. This temporal displacement is not an error. It is a consequence of the precessional cycle that gradually shifts stellar positions relative to the calendar date on which they rise heliacally. The Mullapin catalogue was not updated to reflect stellar positions current at the time of its inscription. It was preserved with the original observational data intact, carrying within its astronomical tables a timestamp recording when those observations were first made. The implication is that the Babylonian scribal tradition was maintaining and transmitting observational records accumulated without interruption across 1700 years, suggesting an institutional continuity of astronomical knowledge preservation, spanning a period longer than the entire duration of recorded Western civilization from ancient Greece to the present day. The precessional encoding within Mullapin extends beyond the heliacal rising dates to encompass the mathematical relationships between the 3 pathway divisions themselves. The boundaries between pathways are set at declinations corresponding to the position of the celestial equator during a period well before the text's composition, reflecting the precessional displacement of the equatorial plane across centuries of observation. When the mathematical constants defining these boundary positions are extracted and analyzed, they produce values consistent with precessional calculation, accurate to within a fraction of 1 degree, a precision requiring sustained systematic observation across a minimum of several centuries, and a mathematical framework capable of detecting the extremely slow, angular drift of the equatorial plane across the background of fixed stars. The Greek astronomer Hipparchus is credited by conventional history with discovering precession in approximately 130 BC. The Mullapin catalogue preserves evidence of precessional calculation at least 1500 years before Hipparchus described what he apparently rediscovered, and the mathematical constants embedded in the catalogue's organizational architecture are not incidental products of record-keeping. They are the structural signature of a knowledge system that was designed from the beginning to carry this information across whatever periods of cultural disruption might interrupt the institutional continuity of the scribal tradition. The broader Babylonian astronomical tradition that includes Mullapin comprises one of the most extensively documented programs of systematic celestial observation in the ancient world. The series known as Enuma Anu Enlil, encompassing approximately 70 tablets of celestial omens, contains within its omen literature specific astronomical data, including eclipse cycles, planetary position records, and stellar magnitude estimates whose precision consistently exceeds what should have been achievable using the observational instruments available in the ancient Near East. The astronomical diaries maintained by Babylonian temple astronomers from the 7th century BC until at least the 1st century AD represent the longest continuous scientific observational program in human history, spanning over 700 years of uninterrupted systematic data collection. The precision of the eclipse predictions generated from this data, demonstrated by the Saros cycle of 18 years and 11 days, embedded in both the Mollapin compendium and in the practical eclipse prediction tables used by temple astronomers, rivals the accuracy of modern astronomical computation. The astronomical sophistication embedded within the Mesopotamian script tradition constitutes evidence that the scribal institutions were carrying information whose origins reach further back than any conventional model of ancient astronomical development can accommodate. And nowhere does this observation acquire more force than when placed alongside the writing system that appears in Egypt with the same abruptness as Sumerian cuneiform and carries its own encoded astronomical tradition, along with an account of its origins, that the physical evidence presents as considerably more significant than mythology. The hieroglyphic writing system of ancient Egypt presents scholars with what may be the single most dramatic example in existence of a script appearing without demonstrable developmental precursors. The earliest confirmed hieroglyphic inscriptions, recovered from the pre-dynastic royal cemetery at Abydos in excavations conducted between 1988 and 1993 by the German Archaeological Institute under the direction of Günter Dreyer, have been radiocarbon dated to approximately 3250 BC. The Abydos inscriptions are not the hesitant experimental markings of a culture in the early stages of developing written communication. They already demonstrate a complete operational writing system employing both phonetic and logographic principles in combination, utilizing a sign inventory encompassing several hundred individual hieroglyphs, and displaying the full range of functional categories including names, titles, numerical notations, and geographical designations that characterize a literate tradition developed over many generations. The problem is that no evidence of those prior generations has been found. The specific context of the Abydos inscriptions provides important details about what the earliest hieroglyphic writing was used to record. The tomb designated UJ at Abydos, which Dreyer's excavations established, belonged to a ruler of the Naqada III period predating the First Dynasty, contained over 200 small bone and ivory tags, bearing hieroglyphic signs that functioned as labels, identifying the origins and contents of goods deposited in the tomb. The signs on these tags already employ the phonetic principle of the rebus, using signs not for what they depict but for the consonantal sounds of the words they picture, a cognitive operation requiring theoretical understanding of the relationship between visual symbol, spoken word, and abstract phonological unit. The tags also employ logographic signs used directly for semantic meaning and what appear to be determinatives, signs added to clarify the category of meaning intended by preceding phonetic signs. The complete tripartite system of Egyptian hieroglyphics, the same system that would characterize the writing for the next 3,000 years of its use, is present in fully operational form in its earliest documented examples. The Nama palette, dating to approximately 3100 BC and housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, demonstrates the hieroglyphic system's immediate completeness with equal clarity. The palette celebrates what appears to be the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under a ruler whose name is written using the signs for a catfish and a chisel, placed within the rectangular enclosure that Egyptologists designate as a serek. The name is written using the phonetic rebus principle, with the initial consonant of the Egyptian word for catfish providing the phonetic value na, and the initial consonant of the word for chisel providing the value mia. This level of phonological sophistication presupposes explicit theoretical analysis of the Egyptian sound system sufficient to isolate consonantal values and assign visual symbols to them consistently, an analytical achievement associated with advanced scribal cultures rather than with nascent attempts at communication. The tradition preserved in Egyptian religious and philosophical literature about who created the hieroglyphic script is consistent, specific, and emphatically non-human in its attribution. The god Thoth, described in the earliest Egyptian sources as the lord of divine words, the measurer of time, and the one who made the writing that records all things, is credited across the entire Egyptian textual tradition with the invention of hieroglyphics. In the dialogue preserved by Plato in his Timaeus, attributed to the Egyptian priests of Sais, speaking to the Athenian statesman Solon, the Egyptian tradition is described as holding that their sacred records extend back 8,000 years, and were established by divine beings who governed Egypt directly during the first time. The Edfu building texts, inscribed on the walls of the Ptolemaic temple at Edfu but explicitly preserving records claimed to originate from the time of the gods, describe the construction of sacred buildings according to plans brought from the original sacred mound that appeared at the beginning of creation, plans recorded in a form of writing that preceded and underlaid the hieroglyphic system visible to human scribes. The consistency between the Egyptian tradition of divine scriptural authorship and the Sumerian tradition of received language administered by Enki represents a cross-cultural parallel whose implications conventional comparative scholarship has not pursued with the seriousness the evidence demands. Those implications become fully apparent when the most systematic ancient documentation of divine administrative governance is examined with the attention it requires. Among the most significant and systematically underinterpreted categories of text in the Nippur cuneiform corpus are the god lists, systematic compilations of divine names and their associated attributes, territorial domains, and administrative functions that were maintained by Mesopotamian scribal schools across the entire span of Babylonian and Assyrian literate civilization. The most comprehensive of these documents, designated by scholars as the Great God List of Weidner and preserved across multiple tablet fragments, including specimens in the British Museum and the University Museum in Philadelphia, contains entries for over 500 individual named divine beings, organized according to a hierarchical schema that reflects precise administrative categories with no obvious mythological function. What has received insufficient critical attention is the nature of the information these lists actually record. The entries do not describe the mythological narratives or ritual functions associated with deities in the manner of theological texts. They record administrative details, including territorial jurisdictions measured in specific land units, resource allocation responsibilities, personnel under each entity's authority, and reporting obligations within what the texts present as an operational governance structure. The god list tradition in Mesopotamian cuneiform encompasses multiple related series that together constitute the most comprehensive ancient documentation of divine administrative organization in existence. The most elaborate of these series, known to scholars as an equals annum from its opening line, establishing the equivalence of the Sumerian sky god Anu with his Akkadian counterpart, was edited in its most complete form by Richard Littke of Yale University in a study published in 1998 that identified the series as encompassing approximately 2,000 individual divine names, distributed across 7 tablets, organized according to administrative hierarchy. Grouping by mythological narrative is absent. Grouping by cult geography is absent. What governs the series throughout is positional rank within a governance structure that assigns specific domains of responsibility to each named entity, specifies the territorial boundaries within which each entity exercises authority, and identifies the personnel and resources placed under each entity's administration. The administrative language of the An equals Anum series is not theological language. It is the same bureaucratic vocabulary that appears in the thousands of administrative tablets from Mesopotamian temple and palace archives, recording the management of human agricultural estates and commercial operations. The terms describing divine territorial authority are the same terms used to describe the landholdings of human temple estates. The terms describing divine personnel are the same terms used in records of human labor assignments. The terms describing resource allocation to divine entities are structurally identical to the terms used in records of rations distributed to human temple workers. What the An equals Anum series presents, in the dry bureaucratic language of ancient Near Eastern estate management, is a complete organizational chart of a governance structure that its composers treated not as mythological description, but as accurate administrative record requiring the same precision in specification that governed any other institutional document in the Mesopotamian scribal tradition. The territorial jurisdictions recorded in the god lists are specified with precision that goes beyond what mythological or theological purposes would require. Specific boundary markers, directional orientations, and area measurements appear in entries describing individual divine domains, providing spatial coordinates that in several cases can be correlated with actual geographical features of Mesopotamia and surrounding regions. The Nippur tablets belonging to the lexical series Ura, which encompasses related lists of lands, cities, and geographical features alongside the divine entities associated with them, provides additional precision for these territorial records, mapping specific rivers, mountain ranges, and agricultural zones to specific divine administrative authorities. The level of geographical specificity in these combined series suggests that their composers were working from actual surveys of territorial boundaries rather than from mythological tradition, and the specific divine entities whose territorial assignments appear most frequently are precisely those whose names and associated knowledge domains appear with equal consistency in the technical literature of the scribal tradition. The knowledge domain administered by Enki in the god list corresponds exactly to the regions where the earliest and most technically sophisticated Sumerian cities were established. The practical implications of this correspondence reach their most dramatic expression in the specific body of technical knowledge that the scribal tradition attributed directly to divine instruction, and that modern analysis confirms contains information its supposed human authors should not have been able to possess. The medical cuneiform tablets that form a substantial portion of the library, assembled by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh between approximately 668 and 627 BC, now held primarily in the British Museum collection under the series designation KH, represent one of the most technically sophisticated bodies of ancient medical literature in existence. The corpus encompasses over 800 individual tablets, addressing diagnostics, pharmacology, surgical procedures, and what the texts themselves designate as the secrets of the healer. The pharmacological knowledge preserved in these tablets was subjected to systematic analysis by the medical historian John Scurlock, whose work published in 2005 documented over 900 distinct medicinal preparations employing plant, mineral, and animal substances. What makes this pharmaceutical knowledge particularly anomalous is not its breadth, but its specificity. Dosage calculations, preparation sequences, contraindications, and administration methods are described with a precision that suggests systematic clinical experimentation extending across many generations of controlled observation rather than accumulated folk wisdom transmitted through ordinary oral tradition. The diagnostic tradition within the medical library encompasses the series known by its Akkadian opening words as Sagig, meaning if a patient, comprising 40 tablets organized systematically from neurological symptoms at the head to lower extremity conditions, with internal organs addressed according to a head-to-foot anatomical survey demonstrating systematic understanding of human physiology. The series was compiled in its canonical form by a physician scholar named Zagilkin Apli of Borsippa around 1069 BC, according to a colophon preserved in surviving tablets, but the series explicitly attributes its content to sources considerably older, describing the diagnostic procedures as having been transmitted from the Apkallu sages who served as advisors to the antediluvian rulers recorded in the Sumerian king list. The pharmacological preparations in the Ashurbanipal corpus have been analysed in terms of their active chemical constituents by Scurlock and Burton Anderson, whose comprehensive study Diagnoses in Assyrian and Babylonian Medicine, published in 2005, identified the botanical identities and pharmacological activities of the substances described. Willow bark, appearing in multiple preparations for pain and fever, contains salicylic acid, the active compound that 19th century chemistry isolated and reformulated as aspirin. Sulfur compounds appear in preparations for skin infections in concentrations that modern dermatology recognizes as effective against the bacterial and fungal pathogens the preparations were designed to treat. Copper and silver salts appear in preparations for wound treatment in forms whose antimicrobial activity is confirmed by modern microbiology. The question that this chemical specificity raises is not whether the ancient physicians knew these preparations worked. They demonstrably did. The question is how they determined with such precision which compounds were effective for which conditions and at what concentrations, given that systematic pharmacological experimentation of the kind that would produce this specificity requires controlled clinical trials that no ancient Mesopotamian institution was supposed to have conducted. The surgical knowledge preserved in the Ashurbanipal library and in the parallel corpus of the Edwin Smith papyrus from Egypt extends the medical anomaly into a domain even more resistant to conventional explanation. The Edwin Smith papyrus, an Egyptian medical text dated in its surviving copy to approximately 1600 BC, contains 48 case studies of injuries organized according to systematic clinical categories, including examination procedures, diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment for each case. James Henry Breasted, who published the first complete translation in 1930, recognized that the clinical methodology demonstrated in the papyrus implied a compositional history considerably older than the surviving manuscript. Case 6 describes a cranial fracture with meningeal symptoms, including the bulging of brain tissue visible through the fracture site, a clinical observation that requires both systematic anatomical knowledge and repeated clinical examination of comparable injuries to identify and describe accurately. The treatment recommendation for inoperable cases uses a technical term meaning an ailment not to be treated, demonstrating understanding of the distinction between survivable and unsurvivable injuries that could only be based on extensive systematic clinical experience across a large enough patient population to establish statistically reliable prognostic patterns. The medical knowledge preserved in these ancient texts cannot be explained as the product of accumulated trial and error within any known ancient cultural context. The precision and specificity of the pharmacological and surgical knowledge exceeds what trial and error learning within a pre-scientific medical tradition can plausibly produce in the time frames the archaeological record provides. The cuneiform texts themselves, in their explicit attribution of medical knowledge to the Apkallu sages, and their placement of medical training within the most restricted categories of scribal education, provide the explanation the evidence supports. This knowledge was transmitted through the scribal tradition from sources that the tradition itself identified as predating human civilization. The question of how that transmission was structured, and specifically how the scribal system was designed to channel certain categories of knowledge through controlled pathways to prepared recipients, becomes most acute when the investigation turns to the writing system whose very existence remains the most unexplained achievement in the entire history of human literacy. In 1905, the British Egyptologist Flinders Petrie, conducting excavations at the turquoise mining site of Serabit el-Qadim in the Sinai Peninsula, discovered inscriptions on the walls of a temple dedicated to the goddess Hathor that would subsequently be identified as the earliest confirmed examples of alphabetic writing. The inscriptions, designated Proto-Sinaitic and dated by subsequent analysis to approximately 1750 BC, display a system of approximately 30 symbols that derive visually from Egyptian hieroglyphic prototypes, but function according to an entirely different organizational principle. Where hieroglyphics employed a complex mixed system of logograms, phonetic signs, and determinatives requiring mastery of hundreds of individual characters accumulated across generations of scribal training, Proto-Sinaitic apparently used its limited sign inventory to represent only consonantal sounds, creating a system from which all subsequent alphabets, including the Phoenician, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin alphabets, ultimately descend. The cognitive leap from hieroglyphic principle to alphabetic principle is so fundamental that scholars have spent over a century debating whether it could represent an independent human invention at all. Petrie's discovery consisted of approximately 48 inscribed objects, including sphinx figurines, plaques, and stone surfaces within the Hathor temple complex. The surviving inscriptions were first systematically interpreted by the Egyptologist Alan Gardner, who published his analysis in 1916, and identified the organizational principle by which the signs functioned. Gardner recognized that each Proto-Sinaitic sign derived visually from a corresponding Egyptian hieroglyphic, but carried a phonetic value equal to the initial consonant of the Semitic word for what the Egyptian hieroglyphic depicted. The sign derived from the Egyptian hieroglyphic for an ox head carries the consonantal value aleph because the Semitic word for ox is aleph. The sign derived from the Egyptian hieroglyphic for a house carries the consonantal value bet because the Semitic word for house is beit. The sign derived from the Egyptian hieroglyphic for a hand carries the value kaf because the Semitic word for hand is kaf. This acrophonic principle, through which the initial consonant of a sign's name becomes its phonetic value, operates with complete consistency across the entire Proto-Sinaitic sign inventory and generates the basis from which every subsequent alphabet on Earth ultimately descends. The conventional explanation for how this cognitive transformation occurred places it in the social context of Serabit el-Qadim, where Egyptian royal expeditions employed Semitic workers to perform turquoise extraction. These workers, the conventional account proposes, possessed sufficient familiarity with Egyptian hieroglyphics to borrow sign forms from the script they observed their Egyptian supervisors using but insufficient training in the full system to master its complex conventions. They therefore simplified the borrowed signs by using them only for their phonetic values, inadvertently inventing the alphabetic principle in the process. This explanation accounts adequately for the choice of Egyptian hieroglyphic forms as visual prototypes. It does not adequately account for the theoretical sophistication of the cognitive operation involved. The alphabetic principle is not a simplification of the hieroglyphic system. It is a theoretical reorganization of the relationship between visual symbol and phonological unit, requiring explicit isolation of the consonantal component of a syllabic or logographic sign's phonetic content, identification of the initial consonant of the sign's name as the relevant phonological unit, and systematic extension of this relationship across an entire sign inventory to produce a complete consonantal writing system. This is not a naive or accidental cognitive operation. It requires explicit phonological analysis of exactly the kind that advanced scribal training in sophisticated writing systems was specifically designed to produce. The question of who at a Semitic mining settlement in the Sinai Peninsula possessed this level of phonological theoretical sophistication and how they acquired it is one that the conventional social explanation cannot answer. The subsequent trajectory of the alphabetic principle compounds the difficulty. The Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions date to approximately 1750 BC. The next clearly attested stage of development, the Proto-Canaanite inscriptions appearing at sites in the Levant around 1400 BC, displays the same fundamental organizational principles with relatively minor sign modifications. The Phoenician alphabet, providing the most direct ancestor of the Greek, Latin, and all Western European alphabets, appears in fully standardized form at approximately 1050 BC. Between Serabit el-Qadim and the mature Phoenician alphabet lies a 700-year developmental period for which the archaeological record of intermediate forms is extremely sparse, raising precisely the same question that the sudden appearances of Sumerian cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphics raise. The alphabetic principle appears to have arrived at Serabit el-Qadim in a form sufficiently complete to generate an entire subsequent tradition, from a context that conventional archaeology cannot identify as independently capable of producing it, suggesting that what occurred at the Sinai mining site was not invention but transmission, a controlled release of a specific organizational principle at a specific historical moment through a specific social channel, by an agency that the evidence assembled throughout this investigation consistently suggests was something other than the human cultures through which the knowledge passed. The pattern of controlled transmission through specific human channels, which the evidence from Serabit el-Qadim establishes so precisely for the alphabetic principle, appears nowhere more explicitly documented in the ancient world than in the institutional project that represents antiquity's most ambitious attempt to recover and consolidate the complete body of knowledge these transmission chains had been designed to preserve. The royal library assembled by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at his palace complex at Nineveh during the 7th century BC represents the most ambitious systematic knowledge preservation project documented in the ancient Near East before the establishment of the Library of Alexandria, and it differs from Alexandria in a crucial respect. The Alexandrian collection was a prestige project designed to accumulate the intellectual products of the known world. The Ashurbanipal archive, as the king's own inscriptions make unambiguously clear, was a recovery mission. The library, discovered by Austin Henry Layard, and Hormuzd Rassam during excavations conducted between 1845 and 1851, and now held primarily in the British Museum collection, yielded approximately 30,000 cuneiform tablets and fragments. Ashurbanipal's own dedicatory inscriptions describe himself as one who reads tablets from before the flood, who deciphers stone inscriptions from distant ages, who seeks tablets containing words of command over all living creatures. The language of collection and recovery, combined with the library's systematic organization into thematic series, indicates that Ashurbanipal understood himself to be consolidating knowledge of extraordinary antiquity. The specific language of Ashurbanipal's royal inscriptions regarding his library represents one of the most remarkable self-descriptions left by any ancient ruler. The king claims in one inscription that he has mastered all the art of writing of every kind, reading the tablets of Sumer and Akkad in their original forms, deciphering inscriptions on stone from distant ages, and examining sealed tablets that no previous king had read. The phrase tablets from before the flood appears in this context not as poetic embellishment, but alongside specific descriptions of the content of those tablets, including astronomical calculations, medical procedures and ritual formulas, and alongside claims about the age of copied source materials that would place original compositions in the antediluvian period described in the Sumerian king list. The implication of this language is that Ashurbanipal and his scholarly advisors understood themselves to be recovering knowledge that had survived the Mesopotamian flood event through deliberate preservation, and that the recovery project was urgent precisely because those preservation channels were in danger of being permanently broken. The discovery of the Nineveh Library by Layard and Rassam gave the modern world its first access to the comprehensive extent of the ancient knowledge preservation system. Rassam's discovery in 1853 of the library rooms adjacent to Ashurbanipal's palace revealed the full scale of the collection. The tablets were organized into specific series, each comprising a set of numbered tablets, whose content addressed a single domain of knowledge according to standardized scholarly conventions. The Enuma Anu Enlil series of celestial omens encompasses approximately 70 tablets. The canonical Gilgamesh epic comprises 12 tablets, including the 11th whose flood narrative George Smith of the British Museum identified in 1872 as a Babylonian parallel to the biblical deluge, an identification that created a worldwide scholarly sensation and opened the field of ancient Near Eastern comparative mythology to sustained academic attention. The medical diagnostic series Say-Gig comprises 40 tablets organized systematically from head to foot. The Enuma Elish creation epic comprises 7 tablets. The incantation series known as Maklu encompasses 8 tablets of ritual procedures for protection against malevolent supernatural forces. Each series within the library bears colophons, scribble notes added at the end of individual tablets that provide crucial information about the source materials from which the Ashurbanipal copies were made. Many colophons describe the tablets as copies of copies, reproduced from documents designated as ancient originals predating the flood. The phrase Nishulabiri, meaning ancient tablet, appears with consistent regularity in these colophons, indicating that the Ashurbanipal scribes understood themselves to be reproducing materials of extraordinary age rather than composing original scholarship. The colophons identify by name the scholars responsible for each series' copying and organization, creating a documented transmission chain linking the 7th century BC library to source materials described as predating the flood narrative. This transmission chain, explicit in the physical documents themselves, is precisely what the investigation's accumulated evidence suggests should exist between the sudden appearances of advanced writing systems in the archaeological record and the antediluvian civilization those writing systems claim to record. What makes Ashurbanipal's project particularly revealing is the explicit discrimination it demonstrates between categories of knowledge considered worth preserving and those not. The Nineveh Library contains essentially no contemporary administrative records, no commercial transactions, and no political correspondence from Ashurbanipal's own reign. Its content is dominated by astronomical, medical, ritual, mathematical, lexical, and mythological series, representing the accumulated technical knowledge of Mesopotamian civilization across more than 2 millennia. This selective focus confirms that Ashurbanipal and his scholarly advisors understood the library's function not as documentation of the present, but as preservation of the deep past, specifically the antediluvian past described in the scribal tradition's most ancient sources. The recovery mission the library represents was not merely a scholarly enterprise. It was, by the evidence of the king's own inscriptions and the library's selective content, an attempt to consolidate and preserve knowledge that the scribal tradition treated as received from sources the ancient world did not consider human. The traditions that describe those sources with the most systematic consistency across the widest geographical distribution of any evidence examined in this investigation reveal a pattern whose implications cannot be contained within any conventional explanatory framework. The tradition that writing was not invented by human beings, but received from divine or non-human sources, appears with extraordinary consistency across ancient cultures that had no documented contact with one another across the full span of recorded history. The Sumerian accounts attribute the origin of cuneiform to the god Enki, who is described in the composition Enki and Ninmah as the one who opened the ears of the human people and gave them the capacity to receive and record divine instruction in a permanent medium. The ancient Egyptian tradition, preserved in the pyramid texts and elaborated in later religious literature, attributes the invention of hieroglyphics to the god Thoth, described in Abydos inscriptions as the Lord of Divine Words who gave the gift of writing to humanity at the beginning of the current cosmic age as a means of preserving knowledge that would otherwise be lost during periods of civilizational collapse. The Hindu Vedic tradition attributes the origin of the Sanskrit script to the god Brahma, described in the Vayu Purana as having created the Devanagari alphabet as a direct transcription of the vibrational patterns underlying the structure of physical reality itself, not as a human invention but as a disclosure of existing cosmic order. The Norse tradition, preserved in the Havamal, one of the major poems of the Elder Edda compiled in approximately the 13th century of the Common Era from oral traditions of considerably greater antiquity, describes the god Odin hanging suspended from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights, wounded by a spear and without food or water, until he perceived the runes existing in the depths beneath the tree and took them up. The language of this account is precise in a way that distinguishes it fundamentally from the language used to describe other cultural achievements attributed to divine figures in the Norse tradition. Odin does not create or invent the runes. He perceives them already existing in a specific location and takes them up. The runic symbols are described throughout the Norse tradition not as human constructions, but as forces inherent in the structure of reality that Odin's extreme sacrifice of physical well-being rendered him capable of perceiving and transmitting to humanity. The Chinese tradition attributes the invention of writing to the legendary figure Kang Jie, described in sources including the dictionary Shuowenjieze compiled by Xu Shen around 100 of the Common Era as a court historian who possessed 4 eyes, enabling him to observe both celestial and terrestrial patterns simultaneously. The 4-eyed physical description attributed to Kang Ji places him in the same category as the enhanced human intermediaries described in Mesopotamian texts as the human recipients of divine instruction, beings whose perceptual capabilities exceeded ordinary human limits precisely because of their partial divine origin. The mechanism of Kangji's discovery, observing pre-existing patterns in the natural world and deriving from them the structural principles of the writing system, mirrors the Norse description of Odin perceiving pre-existing runic forces rather than inventing arbitrary symbols. The Mayan tradition attributes the origin of writing and books to Itzamna, the supreme deity of the Mayan pantheon, described as the first priest, the inventor of writing, and the one who gave humanity the arts that distinguish civilization from barbarism. The Aztec tradition attributes foundational knowledge including the calendar system, writing, and ceremonial practices to Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity whose physical description and attributed knowledge domains closely parallel those of Enki in the Sumerian tradition. Both figures are associated with water, with wisdom, with the creation of human beings, and with the transmission of civilizational technologies to humanity, and both are described as departing or withdrawing from human affairs at a specific historical moment after completing an instructional mission, a parallel that the evidence from the departure texts examined in comparative studies of Mesopotamian literature makes distinctly less metaphorical than conventional mythology scholarship has treated it. What makes this global pattern analytically decisive is not merely its consistency across cultures, but the specific contrast it presents with how those same cultures describe other technological achievements. Agricultural practices, pottery making, metallurgy, navigation, and architecture are described in ancient mythological traditions as human inventions, products of accumulated experimentation and intergenerational learning. Writing alone, in every ancient tradition that addresses its origins directly, is described as received rather than invented. This distinction is not a default mythological reflex applied uniformly to all cultural achievements. The ancient traditions were entirely capable of describing technological development as human achievement, and they exercise that capability consistently for every technology except writing. The universal attribution of writing to non-human sources represents a considered distinction, and it converges with the physical, archaeological evidence in a way that demands engagement rather than dismissal. The specific technical character of what those sources are described as having transmitted becomes most revealing when the investigation examines the descriptions of the communication medium through which, according to the ancient traditions, the original transmission occurred. Across the traditions of multiple ancient and medieval cultures, a persistent concept appears under various designations but with consistent underlying meaning that conventional comparative religion has not adequately addressed. The Arabic tradition of the Islamic Golden Age refers to the lisan al-tayr, the language of birds, as a form of divine communication, accessible only to prophets and the most advanced sages, described in sources including the 12th century mystical epic Conference of the Birds by the Persian poet Fariduddin Attar, not as metaphorical spiritual elevation, but as a literally operative communication system with identifiable technical characteristics. The Greek tradition preserved in the writings of Porphyry and Iamblichus describes a sacred language of the divine realm that operates through principles fundamentally different from ordinary human speech, conveying meaning through vibrational qualities of sound rather than through arbitrary conventional symbols. The Sufi mystical tradition treats this language as a complete communication system that encodes multiple simultaneous levels of meaning, including literal, allegorical, moral and esoteric dimensions within single utterances. What has not been sufficiently emphasized is that across all these traditions, this language is described not as invented but as pre-existing and discovered. Iamblichus of Chalcis, the Neoplatonist philosopher of the late 3rd and early 4th centuries of the Common Era, dedicates a substantial portion of his treatise on the mysteries to describing the operational principles of what he calls the theurgic names, sequences of sounds used in ritual context that he explicitly distinguishes from ordinary language on the grounds that they do not derive their efficacy from semantic meaning, but from their intrinsic vibrational properties. Iamblichus argues that translating these names into another language destroys their efficacy, not because meaning is lost, but because the specific acoustic qualities that enable them to function are phonologically encoded in the original sequences and cannot survive translation. This claim places the theurgic names in the same category as the voces magicae, the untranslatable names preserved in the Greek magical papyri, whose language has resisted identification as belonging to any known linguistic tradition, and whose preservation in Greek language ritual texts indicates they were transmitted as phonologically fixed sequences, whose operational function was independent of any semantic content comprehensible to their users. The Hebrew Kabbalistic tradition develops this framework with particular precision through the concept of Lashon HaKodesh, the Holy Tongue, described in sources including the Sefer Yetzirah, a mystical text drawing on traditions of considerable antiquity, as the original language from which all human languages derived, following the dispersal described in the Tower of Babel narrative. Each letter of the Hebrew alphabet is assigned in the Kabbalistic tradition not only a phonetic value and a semantic domain, but a numerical value and a cosmological correspondence, such that the alphabet functions as a multidimensional encoding system in which each character simultaneously represents a sound, a number, and a structural principle of the created universe. This description of an alphabet whose sign conventions correspond to actual structural features of physical reality rather than being arbitrary cultural agreements is precisely the description that the Vedic tradition offers for the Sanskrit alphabet. The Vedic concept of Vak, divine speech, elaborated in texts including the Rig Veda and the Mimamsa philosophical commentaries, describes language as operating at 4 levels: Para, the transcendent pre-linguistic vibrational state; Pashyanti, the luminous intermediate state where meaning first differentiates; Madhyama, the mental level where language takes conceptual form; and Vaikari, the spoken level accessible to ordinary human consciousness. The Mimamsa school maintained the doctrine that Sanskrit is eternal and uncreated, existing independently of human consciousness as an intrinsic feature of reality whose patterns the human ear perceives but does not generate. This philosophical position, which differs fundamentally from any modern linguistic understanding of language as a conventional system, parallels with remarkable precision what Iamblichus describes about theurgic language, what the Kabbalistic tradition describes about Hebrew, and what the Sumerian tradition describes about language as a fundamental principle of reality rather than a human cultural product. The implication across all these traditions is that the writing systems encoding this sacred language were not tools designed by human cultural development, but instruments designed to capture and transmit structural properties of reality that pre-existed any human culture and that required specific preparation to perceive and record. The civilization that inherited the most direct written record of this tradition demonstrates in the specific way it treated its received linguistic inheritance exactly what the evidence of this kind of transmission would predict. The linguistic relationship between Sumerian and Akkadian represents one of the most unusual language contact situations in the entire recorded history of human communication. Sumerian and Akkadian belong to entirely different language families with no demonstrable common ancestor. Sumerian is a language isolate with no identified relatives, displaying grammatical and structural features that set it apart from every other language documented in the ancient or modern world, including its ergative case system, its complex system of verbal prefixes, and its use of grammatical gender categories that operate according to principles not replicated elsewhere. Akkadian is a Semitic language related to later tongues including Babylonian, Assyrian, Arabic, and Hebrew. Despite these fundamental structural differences, the Akkadian scribal tradition that gradually absorbed and eventually replaced Sumerian as the administrative language of Mesopotamia during the 3rd millennium BC, treated Sumerian not as a superseded predecessor, but as a sacred and uniquely authoritative medium that retained specific communicative functions long after it ceased to be spoken by ordinary populations. Sumerian religious and liturgical texts were preserved, copied, and studied in Babylonian scribal schools for over 2,000 years after the language's death, a tradition that ancient scribal commentaries justify explicitly by reference to the language's non-human origin. The grammatical features of Sumerian that distinguish it most dramatically from every other known language reflect what linguists describe as a typological profile without parallel. The ergative absolutive alignment of Sumerian grammar, in which the subject of a transitive verb receives different grammatical marking from the subject of an intransitive verb, differs fundamentally from the nominative accusative alignment of Akkadian and most of the world's languages. The complex verbal prefix template of Sumerian, through which multiple grammatical categories including subject, object, indirect object, locative, and directional information are simultaneously encoded within a single verbal form using a template of up to 10 sequential prefix slots, has no known parallel in any other documented language. John Hayes of the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, in his comprehensive Sumerian grammar published in 1990, described this verbal system as demonstrating a type of grammatical complexity that cannot be derived from any known antecedent language family, and cannot be shown to have influenced the development of any subsequent linguistic tradition. These features suggest a language that did not grow from any identifiable cultural or geographical source, but was, as the Mesopotamian scribal tradition insisted, constituted according to principles external to ordinary human linguistic development. The Amisal dialect of Sumerian, used exclusively in liturgical contexts and specifically in compositions attributed to female divine figures and to the gala priests who performed ritual laments, represents a systematic phonological and lexical variant whose operational domain was restricted entirely to ritual performance. The preservation of Amisal as a distinct dialect long after Sumerian had ceased to be spoken indicates that the Akkadian scribal tradition maintained it specifically because its ritual domain was considered to require the specific phonological features of this variant, rather than either standard Sumerian or Akkadian. The last dated cuneiform tablet written in Sumerian was produced around 100 of the Common Era, more than 2,000 years after the language had ceased to be anyone's native tongue. This extraordinary longevity of a dead language as a functional, scholarly and ritual medium has no parallel in the history of human linguistic practice of comparable duration, and the scribal commentaries that maintain the tradition explicitly justified it by reference to what the Sumerian tradition itself preserved as its origin. Not human development, but divine transmission through a channel that the scribal institutions were designed to perpetuate across whatever historical disruptions might threaten it. The Akkadian scribal tradition's treatment of Sumerian as a sacred medium whose use was maintained by reference to its divine origin provides a crucial link between the origins of ancient writing systems and the cross-cultural linguistic convergences that contemporary analysis has begun to document with a precision that conventional historical linguistics cannot explain. The hypothesis of a common ancestral language underlying the world's linguistic diversity has a long and scientifically contested history, but recent computational linguistics research has produced findings that exceed what conventional models of independent linguistic development can comfortably accommodate. The work of the Russian linguists Sergei Starostin and Vitaly Shevoroshkin on the proposed Nostratic macrofamily, encompassing Indo-European, Semitic, Dravidian, Uralic, Altaic, and several other major language families, generated substantial scholarly controversy, but produced specific lexical and grammatical correspondences between languages presumed to be completely unrelated that exceed what statistical chance would predict under any reasonable model of independent development. More significantly, the correspondences cluster with unusual consistency around a specific semantic domain. The vocabulary that shows the strongest cross-family parallels involves terms for celestial phenomena, for beings described as coming from the sky, for concepts of divine instruction, and for the materials and procedures associated with writing itself. This clustering is not predicted by conventional historical linguistics and has not received the systematic analytical attention it demands. The Nostratic hypothesis was first formally articulated by the Danish linguist Holger Pedersen in 1903, drawing on the Latin nostras meaning of our land, to designate a proposed macrofamily encompassing the major language groups of Eurasia and Northern Africa. The systematic development of the hypothesis into a documented scholarly program was undertaken by the Soviet linguist Vladislav Ilyich Svitish during the 1960s, whose posthumously published comparative dictionary established specific reconstructed proto-Nostratic roots with supporting evidence from multiple language families. His work was continued by Aharon Dolgopolsky of the University of Haifa, whose Nostratic dictionary represents the most comprehensive single compilation of proposed cross-family correspondences, and by Sergei Starostin of the Russian Academy of Sciences, whose mathematical approach to establishing regular sound correspondences between language families applied the comparative method that proved successful in establishing Indo-European family relationships to the much larger proposed macro-family. The semantic clustering that makes the Nostratic correspondences particularly significant for this investigation is most clearly visible in the domain of terms for divine or celestial beings. The Proto-Indo-European root deu, reconstructed as the basis for the Greek Zeus, the Latin deus and dies, the Sanskrit deos, and Baltic terms for sky and deity, corresponds to proposed Nostratic roots in Semitic, Dravidian, and Kartvelian language families in its basic consonantal structure. The word for primordial waters or flood across language families shows correspondences that the Sumerian tradition makes particularly revealing. The Sumerian Abzu, designating the freshwater underground ocean that Enki governs, corresponds phonologically to the Akkadian Apsu, to the Sanskrit ap and apus meaning water, to the Celtic prefix erb meaning river preserved in place names across Western Europe, and to the Proto-Indo-European root reconstructed for water across multiple descendant languages. These correspondences across language families that conventional historical linguistics treats as unrelated suggest that the terminology associated with the Anunnaki cosmological framework was encoded into language families that diverged from a common source during or after the period described in the flood narratives of every culture examined throughout this investigation. Murray Gell-Mann, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist whose later career at the Santa Fe Institute included significant research into language evolution, collaborated with the linguist Merritt Rulin on analysis of the statistical properties of proposed deep-time linguistic correspondences. Their work identified a set of proposed proto-world roots, fundamental vocabulary items showing cross-family correspondences that could potentially reflect a single ancestral language, predating the divergence of all known language families. The semantic categories showing the strongest proposed correspondences include not only common vocabulary items like body parts and kinship terms, but terms for sky, water, fire, and transcendent beings. The same semantic domains that show the highest concentration of cross-family parallels in the Nostratic hypothesis. Sumerians' position within this analytical framework creates a paradox that conventional historical linguistics cannot resolve. As a language isolate with no identified relatives in any known family, Sumerian should show no systematic correspondences with any other language beyond statistical chance. Yet the specific terms in Sumerian associated with divine beings, astronomical phenomena, flood narratives, and knowledge transmission show proposed correspondences with vocabulary in distant language families that several researchers have documented, but that the field has generally been reluctant to pursue because no conventional mechanism of linguistic relationship can account for them. If the Sumerian language was, as the ancient scribal tradition consistently claimed, a received medium whose forms were transmitted from a source that preceded the divergence of human language families, then its showing correspondences with the divine and astronomical vocabulary of unrelated families would be expected rather than anomalous, and the cross-cultural pattern of identical knowledge transmission documented throughout this investigation would have left precisely the linguistic signature that the computational analysis of ancient vocabulary has begun to reveal. The linguistic signatures revealed by computational analysis represent the deepest surviving traces of a knowledge transmission network whose institutional history is documented with remarkable specificity in the organizations that conventional scholarship has most consistently mischaracterized as simply religious or philosophical. The mystery school institutions of the ancient world, whatever their overt religious and philosophical functions, can be understood at an operational level as sophisticated knowledge preservation systems specifically engineered to maintain sensitive technical information through periods of political disruption, cultural collapse, and deliberate institutional suppression. The Hermetic schools of Alexandria, the Pythagorean brotherhoods of Magna Graecia, the Orphic mystery traditions of the Greek world, and the priestly colleges of Babylon and Memphis all employed initiation structures that served, among other purposes, as precision information security systems designed to ensure that specific knowledge passed only to individuals who had undergone extended preparation and whose discretion could be guaranteed through binding ritual obligation. The classical scholar Walter Burkert, in his foundational analysis Law and Science in Ancient Pythagoreanism, documented the degree to which mathematical knowledge that should have been unavailable in the 6th century BC appears fully formed in Pythagorean tradition without traceable developmental precursors, and identified the mystery school transmission system as the only mechanism capable of explaining the gap between what the Pythagoreans knew and what contemporary Greek culture could have independently produced. The specific mathematical knowledge preserved within the Pythagorean tradition provides the most precisely documented example of how the mystery school transmission system maintained ancient knowledge across the discontinuities of civilizational history. Pythagoras himself, according to the biographical account preserved by the Neoplatonist philosopher Iamblichus in his Life of Pythagoras, spent 22 years studying in Egyptian temple schools and an additional 12 years in Babylon before establishing his own school at Croton in southern Italy in the late 6th century BC. These totals, if accurate, imply that Pythagoras received his mathematical and philosophical training within the same institutional systems that this investigation has identified as the primary channels for transmitting knowledge of non-human origin, and that the Pythagorean tradition represents a Mediterranean transmission point for knowledge derived ultimately from the Mesopotamian and Egyptian scribal institutions examined throughout this investigation. The organizational structure of the Pythagorean school preserved the initiation hierarchy that characterized the ancient Near Eastern scribal tradition in a form adapted for its Greek cultural context. The distinction between the akousmatikoi, those who received symbolic and moral precepts through oral instruction, and the mathematikoi, those admitted to the full mathematical and philosophical training, mirrors precisely the distinction documented in the Nippur Edeber texts between students admitted for general literacy and those granted access to what the Sumerian tablets designated as the secrets of the tablet house. The mathematical knowledge available only to the mathematikoi included the theory of irrational numbers, the mathematical relationships governing musical harmony, and what the tradition designated as the sacred tetractes, a triangular arrangement of 10 points whose numerical relationships encoded the mathematical constants governing astronomical cycles, musical intervals, and geometric proportions simultaneously within a single symbolic object. The tetractes and its associated mathematical framework demonstrate the same multi-level information encoding approach identified in the Nippur mathematical corpus and the Kesh temple hymn, suggesting that the Pythagorean tradition was not independently developing these encoding techniques, but inheriting and transmitting them from the older sources, whose institutional custodianship Pythagoras's biographical tradition explicitly describes. The Pythagorean communities were violently suppressed in the late 5th century BC when meeting houses at Croton and Metapontum were burned, killing many members and dispersing survivors throughout the Greek world. The tradition that survived this catastrophe was preserved primarily through the Platonic Academy and through a more restricted lineage that eventually manifested in the Neoplatonist schools of the 3rd through 6th centuries of the Common Era. Plotinus, Porphyry, Iamblichus, and Proclus each contributed to preserving and extending the mathematical and theurgical knowledge of the tradition, with Iamblichus maintaining the most explicit connection to the Mesopotamian sources through his preservation of Chaldean oracular literature and his detailed descriptions of theurgic practice derived from Babylonian temple traditions. The violent destruction of the Alexandrian intellectual community in the late 4th and early 5th centuries of the Common Era, culminating in the murder of the mathematician and philosopher Hypatia in 415 AD, forced the final phase of this transmission into the Islamic world. The scholars of the Islamic Golden Age including Jabir ibn Hayyan, al-Kindi, al-Farabi, and Ibn Sina, preserved and extended the mathematical and philosophical knowledge transmitted through these channels, maintaining its continuity across the intellectual disruptions that accompanied the transformation of the Mediterranean world. The mystery school institutions and their successor organizations thus formed one arm of the ancient knowledge preservation system, the arm responsible for maintaining the interpretive frameworks and initiation protocols necessary for working with what the other arm of the system preserved in a more literal and physical form. The ancient world's most sophisticated response to the threat of knowledge loss was not oral tradition, not the copying of manuscripts in accessible libraries, but the creation of hardened underground archives specifically engineered to survive civilizational collapse, deliberate destruction, and the passage of millennia without maintenance or human attention. The cuneiform corpus from Nippur includes administrative documents describing the construction and maintenance of what the texts designate as houses of sealed wisdom, constructed beneath the major temple complexes of Mesopotamia at considerable labor and material expense. The University of Pennsylvania's excavations at Nippur between 1888 and 1900, directed sequentially by John Punnett Peters, Herman Hilprecht, and John Henry Haynes across a decade of field seasons, uncovered portions of what appears to be an extensive underground complex beneath the Eka Temple, dedicated to Enlil. The excavated chambers, constructed from fired brick sealed with bitumen compounds and rare mineral additives whose combined preservative properties were understood in precise technical detail by their builders, demonstrate construction techniques whose sole evident purpose was the creation of stable, waterproof, atmospherically controlled long-term storage environments for materials of exceptional and irreplaceable value. The most complete confirmation of what these Mesopotamian underground preservation systems contained came through the accidental discovery in 1985 and 1986 by Iraqi archaeologists working at Tel Abu Haba, the ancient site of Sipar, of the only intact ancient Mesopotamian library ever found in its original location and arrangement. The Sipar library yielded approximately 800 tablets organized within their original storage configuration, with tablets belonging to the same series placed together in ways that allowed their original classification system to be reconstructed. The condition of the tablets, preserved within their sealed rooms since the site's abandonment in the 6th century BC, demonstrates the effectiveness of the construction and environmental control techniques used to maintain the collection. More significant than the tablets' physical preservation is the evidence of systematic organization they provide. The Sipar library was not a random accumulation of documents, but a curated collection maintaining the same series structure documented at Nineveh, organized by knowledge domain in ways that mirror the classification system described in Nippur administrative texts discussing the construction of the underground repositories. The Qumran community of Judea provides a culturally distinct parallel that independently developed equivalent physical preservation technology. Between 1946 and 1956, the discovery of 11 caves near the ruins of Qumran on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea yielded approximately 900 manuscripts sealed in clay jars specifically designed to maintain stable atmospheric conditions within the storage vessels. The deliberate engineering of these containers, combining sealed lids, protective wrappings, and the natural low humidity environment of the Judean desert to achieve preservation across approximately 2,000 years, demonstrates that the physical technology for long-term document preservation was understood and applied across widely separated ancient cultural traditions. The copper scroll found at Qumran, inscribed on metal rather than organic material, and encoding specific locations of hidden physical depositories in a deliberately encrypted form provides direct evidence for the existence of additional caches whose locations were considered important enough to preserve in the most durable available medium, using an encoding system designed to restrict access to those who possessed the necessary decipherment keys. The Egyptian tradition of physical knowledge preservation appears in the architectural record of major temple complexes across the Nile Valley. The Perank, or House of Life, documented in administrative text from multiple temple sites including Heliopolis, Memphis, and Abydos, constituted a restricted archive of sacred texts accessible only to initiated priests of specific categories. The Edfu building texts specifically reference underground chambers containing the records of the first time, the primordial period when divine beings governed Egypt directly. The pattern documented across Mesopotamian, Judean, and Egyptian traditions is not a cultural coincidence. It is a globally distributed technology for physical knowledge preservation, implemented across independent traditions with sufficient consistency to suggest derivation from common technical specifications established at the beginning of the traditions that maintained them. And the physical infrastructure this preservation technology created operated alongside a biological infrastructure whose evidence this investigation has not yet fully addressed. The physical infrastructure for knowledge preservation that archaeology has begun to document in detail operated alongside a biological preservation system equally deliberate in its design and equally supported by specific evidence from the ancient record. The ability to read and write in modern neuroscientific understanding is not a single cognitive capacity, but a complex integration of multiple neural systems involving visual processing, phonological awareness, working memory, and semantic categorization that together create what the cognitive neuroscientist Stanislas Dehaene has described as a neuronal recycling process, through which brain structures evolved for other biological purposes are repurposed to support the demands of literacy. What mainstream cognitive science has not adequately addressed is the anomalous distribution of access to advanced scribal knowledge in the ancient world, which the administrative records of Mesopotamia document as being explicitly hereditary rather than meritocratic. The Sumerian scribal tradition, as preserved in administrative tablets from Nippur's Eduba, or tablet house, distinguishes linguistically between students admitted for general literacy training and those granted access to advanced categories of writing that the tablets designate using terminology indicating that this knowledge was understood as constitutionally inaccessible to the majority of human beings regardless of their intellectual capability or length of study. The restriction is not presented as a matter of institutional policy. It is presented as a biological fact about the nature of certain kinds of writing and the kinds of minds that can receive them. Dehaene's neuronal recycling framework identifies the visual word form area of the left occipitotemporal cortex as the brain region that becomes specifically repurposed for written word recognition in literate individuals, a region that in pre-literate brains responds primarily to object and face recognition. The transformation of this region through literacy acquisition represents a significant cortical reorganization that affects not only reading ability, but broader cognitive functions including working memory capacity and pattern recognition speed. What Dehaene's framework does not address is whether the capacity for this cortical reorganization is uniformly distributed across the human population, and it is precisely this question that the ancient scribal tradition consistently answers in the negative. The hereditary scribal families documented in Mesopotamian administrative archives across multiple generations were not hereditary merely by social convention. The administrative texts describe the qualifications for advanced scribal training in terms that consistently invoke biological capacity rather than acquired skill, using language that parallels modern descriptions of cognitive aptitude as a partially heritable trait governed by identifiable biological mechanisms. The gene now designated FOXP2, whose role in human language and speech ability has been extensively studied since its identification in the early 2000s, provides a contemporary scientific framework for understanding how biological differences in linguistic capacity could constitute precisely the kind of heritable trait that the ancient scribal tradition's hereditary access restrictions reflect. FOXP2 differs between humans and our closest evolutionary relatives in ways that appear critical to the development of fully modern language capacity, and its variation within the human population correlates with differences in linguistic processing speed and accuracy. The Atrahasis epic's description of human creation through the mixing of divine genetic material with earthly clay, examined earlier in this investigation as a possible description of actual genetic modification, takes on additional specificity in this context. If the human modification described in Mesopotamian creation texts involved alterations to the genetic basis of language processing capacity, then the differential distribution of this capacity across human populations, documented in the scribal tradition, would follow as a natural consequence of the modification process, and the specific restriction of access to the most advanced categories of scribal knowledge to those who demonstrated this capacity biologically rather than through training would represent accurate recognition of a genuine biological threshold in the capacity to receive and process the specific type of linguistic information the most restricted categories of ancient writing were designed to encode. The biological and institutional mechanisms for preserving access to ancient knowledge systems now confront, for the first time in human history, analytical technologies powerful enough to begin penetrating the defenses those mechanisms were designed to maintain. The application of modern computational and cryptographic analysis to ancient undeciphered scripts has produced results that challenge the conventional scholarly understanding of what these texts contain at a fundamental level. The work of computer scientist Rajesh Rao and colleagues at the University of Washington, published in 2009 in the journal Science, applied entropic analysis to the Indus script and produced a finding that generated immediate academic controversy. The statistical properties of the Indus script, including its organizational complexity, sign frequency distribution, and sequential combinatorial patterns, fall within the mathematical range consistently associated with natural human languages rather than simple accounting notation or religious symbolism. This finding directly contradicts the most widely accepted scholarly dismissal of the Indus script as a non-linguistic sign system and implies that a complete language is encoded in documents that specialists have failed to read for more than 150 years. The implications extend beyond the Indus Valley to raise the possibility that other long-analyzed ancient texts contain information operating at levels of structural complexity that conventional analytical approaches have systematically failed to detect. The follow-up debate that Rao's entropy analysis generated illustrates precisely the methodological difficulty confronting conventional scholarship when its analytical tools begin producing results that exceed its conceptual frameworks. The researchers Farmer, Witzel, and Sproat had argued that the Indus script's short average inscription length was inconsistent with phonographic language recording. Rao's statistical response demonstrated that the inscription length distribution was in fact consistent with logosyllabic recording of the type used in Sumerian cuneiform, where individual seal impressions typically preserved short, administrative designations rather than extended textual passages. The methodological impasse reflects a genuine problem. The Indus script's statistical properties confirm it encodes language, but the linguistic framework that would allow its content to be identified has not been recovered within any surviving cultural tradition. What statistics can confirm and what cultural recovery cannot supply defines the boundary that 4,000 years of civilizational discontinuity has established around what the Indus Valley civilization recorded in a script whose design, whose civilization's sudden appearance, and whose civilization's equally sudden disappearance all follow the pattern that this investigation has documented across every domain of the evidence. The multispectral imaging technology applied to the Archimedes palimpsest beginning in 1998 demonstrated the capacity of modern imaging to recover ancient textual content hidden beneath later inscriptions. The palimpsest, a 13th century prayer book whose parchment had been scraped and reused from an earlier manuscript, proved under multispectral analysis to preserve the text of Archimedes' method of mechanical theorems, a work entirely unknown to modern scholarship before its recovery. Its content revealed that Archimedes had developed analytical methods equivalent to integral calculus more than 1800 years before Newton and Leibniz arrived at their independent formulations. The recovery of this hidden text did not merely expand the known corpus of Archimedes' work. It demonstrated that the Greek mathematician's actual capabilities significantly exceeded what the previously known corpus had allowed scholars to establish, and that a substantial portion of the most advanced ancient mathematical knowledge had been literally hidden beneath later writing and inaccessible to conventional scholarship until imaging technology created the possibility of seeing through the obscuring layers. The same principle applied to the ancient scribal tradition's most carefully preserved and most persistently resistant documents suggest that the investigation now entering its most consequential phase may be approaching the point at which the first layers of the hidden archive begin to yield their content to analytical tools whose capabilities the scribal tradition's designers could not have anticipated. The accumulated weight of the evidence examined throughout this investigation points toward a conclusion that mainstream scholarship has been methodologically unprepared to pursue. The world's earliest writing systems do not emerge from within human culture through the gradual developmental progression that evolutionary models of cognitive history predict. They appear across multiple unrelated civilizations and geographical regions separated by vast distances in forms that are already structurally complete, grammatically sophisticated, and demonstrably capable of encoding layers of astronomical, mathematical, and cosmological information that exceed the independently verifiable knowledge capabilities of the societies that inherited and used them. The global tradition that writing was received from non-human sources is not mythological embellishment applied retrospectively to a mundane historical process of human invention. It is the most consistent explanation in the ancient record for a genuine historical anomaly that physical archaeology confirms, but that conventional scholarship, constrained by its own disciplinary assumptions, cannot adequately account for. The unread tablets, the undeciphered scripts, the engineered underground archives, and the hereditary scribal bloodlines all converge on a single implication that the ancient world stated directly and repeatedly in its own words, in its own preserved writing, across every culture that possessed the capacity to write at all. The evidence from each domain of inquiry examined throughout this investigation reinforces rather than contradicts the evidence from every other domain. The developmental gap documented at Uruk, Abydos, and the Indus Valley is not an isolated anomaly. It occurs simultaneously in multiple unrelated civilizations and is accompanied in each case by a consistent ancient attribution of the writing system to non-human sources whose nature and identity the ancient records describe with a specificity that mythology alone does not explain. The mathematical encoding documented in the Nipper corpus is not a chance feature of administrative notation. It appears across multiple independent compositions and encodes astronomical constants whose calculation required observational capabilities and institutional continuity spanning generations before the first cuneiform sign was pressed into clay. The undeciphered scripts are not simply languages that scholarship has not yet been clever enough to translate. They share statistical properties confirming that they encode language while systematically resisting the analytical approaches that have successfully decoded every other ancient script subjected to comparable investigation, suggesting that their resistance reflects deliberate design rather than scholarly inadequacy. The underground repositories documented at Nippur, Sippar, and Qumran are not the product of coincidental cultural preferences for underground storage. They are the physical remains of a global preservation technology applied with consistent technical specifications across independently documented traditions in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Judea, all of which describe these repositories in texts that attribute their purpose to the preservation of knowledge received from sources that preceded human civilization. The hereditary scribal access restrictions documented across the Mesopotamian administrative corpus reflect a biological understanding of differential cognitive capacity that the ancient tradition grounded not in cultural convention, but in the genetic history described in the creation texts that attributed humanity's current form to deliberate modification by the same entities credited with creating the writing systems that the hereditary scribal families were trained to maintain. The mystery school traditions that preserved fragments of this knowledge through the catastrophic disruptions of the first millennium of the Common Era were not merely philosophical organizations with an antiquarian interest in ancient wisdom. They were the surviving remnants of the institutional transmission chains, maintained specifically to carry the ancient knowledge forward through periods of cultural collapse to the point where civilizational conditions would make its full recovery possible. The computational tools now being applied to ancient undeciphered scripts represent the first analytical technology in human history capable of engaging with the mathematical and linguistic sophistication of the knowledge those chains preserved, and the initial results of that engagement consistently reveal more complexity, more structure, and more sophisticated information encoding than conventional scholarship had predicted. The tablet that was never meant to be read by ordinary eyes, written in a language that the ancient world attributed without exception and without apology to beings whose nature remains the most contested question in the study of human origins, has been waiting in sealed underground chambers, in undeciphered corpora, in the hidden layers beneath palimpsested manuscripts, and in the encoded architectural proportions of monuments whose full mathematical content modern analysis is only beginning to perceive for a period measured in thousands of years. The ancient traditions that preserved knowledge of its existence described it consistently as containing information about the origins of human civilization, the cycles of civilizational rise and collapse, and the nature of the relationship between humanity and the intelligence that, according to every ancient tradition capable of writing down its own origins, first gave writing to the human world. The investigation of that claim, grounded in the physical evidence of archaeology, the statistical analysis of the scripts themselves, the genetic signatures of hereditary scribal lineages, and the mathematical constants encoded in the oldest monuments on Earth, has reached the point where dismissal as mythology is no longer scientifically defensible. What it has not yet reached is the point of full decipherment, and it is precisely in that remaining distance between what the evidence establishes and what the scripts have not yet yielded that the most significant discoveries in the history of human self-understanding remain waiting to be made. The distance between what the evidence establishes and what the ancient scripts have not yet yielded is not merely the distance between the known and the unknown. It is the distance between two fundamentally different frameworks for understanding what humanity is and where it came from. The investigation documented throughout this series has not been an exercise in alternative speculation. It has been a systematic presentation of archaeological, linguistic, mathematical, genetic and institutional evidence drawn from verified excavations, authenticated artifacts, peer-reviewed analyses, and the ancient records themselves, all pointing in the same direction that every culture in the ancient world capable of writing pointed when it described the origins of writing, not toward human invention, toward transmission from sources that the ancient world did not consider human. The paradigm this evidence demands is not a minor adjustment to conventional archaeology. It is a fundamental reconsideration of the timeline of human cognitive development, the mechanisms through which technical knowledge has been transmitted across civilizational discontinuities, and the nature of the relationship between human consciousness and the knowledge systems that human civilization has preserved, but demonstrably did not create. The writing systems that appear without developmental precursors at the dawn of recorded history did not emerge from within the cultures that used them. The mathematical constants encoded in these systems reflect astronomical knowledge that the societies preserving them did not independently possess. The underground repositories engineered to protect that knowledge from civilizational collapse demonstrate planning horizons measured in millennia by institutions that the ancient records consistently describe as predating human civilization itself. The cyclical pattern that ancient traditions from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica documented with mathematical precision the repeated rise and collapse of advanced civilizations across vast astronomical timescales finds its contemporary echo in the accelerating convergence of technological capability and civilizational fragility that characterizes the early decades of the 21st century. The mystery schools that preserved fragments of ancient knowledge through the disruptions of the first millennium of the Common Era understood themselves to be maintaining a transmission chain that extended back to before the last great civilizational collapse, and forward to a future moment when full recovery would become possible. The computational tools, genetic research methods, archaeological technologies, and analytical frameworks now being brought to bear on the ancient records suggest that the moment those institutions anticipated may finally be approaching. What the evidence assembled in this investigation ultimately demands of contemporary humanity is not merely intellectual acknowledgement of an anomaly in the archaeological record. It demands recognition that the oldest and most persistent traditions in the human archive, preserved across the entire span of recorded history, in cultures separated by every conceivable barrier of geography, language, and time, have been attempting to communicate something specific about the origins of human civilization and the nature of the knowledge that civilization was built to preserve. The tablet that was never meant to be read by ordinary eyes was not sealed against discovery forever. It was sealed against premature discovery, preserved for the moment when humanity would have developed both the tools and the understanding necessary to receive what it contains. Whether that moment has arrived, and whether humanity possesses the wisdom to use what the unsealing reveals, is the question that the ancient